Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The howl that echoed through the dark forest wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. It was something different, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and my hand instinctively tighten on my flashlight. That sound would be the beginning of the most terrifying night of my life. My name's Sarah, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest for the past 5 years. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. I thought I understood the rhythms of the forest, the behaviors of its animals, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath hangs in the air and the leaves crunch satisfyingly under your boots. I was on my usual night patrol, making sure no campers had strayed into restricted areas and that all was quiet in my section of the park. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver glow through the trees and creating deep, impenetrable shadows. I just finished checking on a group of campers, a family with 2 kids roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories, when I heard it. That howl. It started low, almost like a moan, before rising to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just the sound itself that unnerved me. It was how unnaturally it echoed through the trees, as if the forest itself was trying to amplify it. I radioed into base. "This is Ranger Sarah. Anyone else hear that?" Static crackled for a moment before Jim's voice came through. "Negative, Sarah. What did you hear?" I described the sound as best I could, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt foolish. It must have been a coyote, I told myself, maybe one that was sick or injured, explaining the strange quality to its cry. "Probably just a coyote," Jim agreed, "but keep an ear out and let me know if you hear it again." I signed off and continued my patrol, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The forest had gone eerily quiet now, as if all the usual nighttime creatures were holding their breath. No owl hoots, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just silence. That's when I saw the tracks. My light swept over the muddy ground, illuminating a set of prints that made me freeze in my tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of a large dog's paw print, but they weren't quite dog-like. The shape was off, with the toes too long and a strange arch to the foot. And strangest of all, they seemed to alternate between 4-legged and 2-legged gaits. I crouched down to examine them more closely, my heart pounding in my chest. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like this. I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures, knowing I'd want to examine them more closely later. As I stood up, I felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. Slowly, I raised my head and swept my flashlight in a wide arc around me. The beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes were huge, glowing an unnatural yellowish green in the flashlight's beam. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest predator, and they were fixed directly on me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I stood there, flashlight trained on those eyes, my other hand hovering near the bear spray on my belt. I knew I should radio for backup, but I couldn't bring myself to look away or make a sound. Then it blinked. Slowly, deliberately, and I realized with a jolt of terror that whatever this thing was, it was intelligent. This wasn't just an animal reacting on instinct, it was studying me. Suddenly, it moved. In the split second before it vanished into the shadows, my flashlight illuminated a massive fur-covered body. It was vaguely wolf-like in shape, but the proportions were all wrong. Its legs were too long, its shoulders too broad, and its face, God, its face. It was a nightmarish blend of wolf and human features, with a pronounced snout full of sharp teeth, but eyes that were set forward like a primate's, glinting with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my radio, Base, this is Sarah, I gasped out. I don't know what I've got. Large predator, unknown species, requesting immediate backup. Jim's voice came back, tense with concern. Sarah, what's your location? Are you safe? I rattled off my coordinates, my eyes darting around the dark forest. I'm okay for now, but this thing, Jim, it's like nothing I've ever seen. It's huge, and it's not natural. Hang tight, Sarah. I'm sending Rangers Mike and Dave your way. They should be there in about 15 minutes. Find a secure location and stay there until they arrive. I acknowledged and clipped the radio back to my belt, trying to calm my racing heart. 15 minutes. I could hold out for 15 minutes. I started to back away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the spot where I'd last seen the creature. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, every snapping twig under my feet sounding like a gunshot in the silence. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl coming from behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, not 20 feet away, stood the creature. In the full illumination of my light, I could see it clearly now, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. It was easily 8 feet tall, standing on 2 legs like a man. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, matted in places with what looked horribly like dried blood. Its hands, if you could call them that, ended in long, curved claws that looked capable of rending flesh from bone with terrifying ease. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a twisted amalgamation of wolf and human features. The snout was elongated like a wolf's, filled with teeth that gleamed wickedly in the moonlight. But the eyes were disturbingly human-like, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that no animal should possess. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I could hear my own ragged breathing, see the plumes of vapor in the cold night air. The creature's chest rose and fell slowly, calmly. It seemed to be assessing me, deciding what to do. Then, in a move that defied everything I thought I knew about animal behavior, it smiled. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a baring of teeth, a promise of violence to come. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was dealing with something far beyond my understanding or experience. I didn't consciously decide to run. One moment I was standing there, paralyzed with fear, and the next I was crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as I fled. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground as it gave chase. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, my legs pumping furiously. I knew the layout of this part of the forest, and I aimed for a nearby ranger station. If I could just make it there, I'd have shelter, weapons, a more powerful radio to call for help. But the creature was fast, so impossibly fast. I could hear it getting closer, its breathing now a series of excited huffs, as if it was enjoying the chase. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. It was running on all fours now, eating up the distance between us with terrifying speed. Just as I thought it was over, that those claws would tear into my back at any second, I burst into a clearing. There, like a beacon of hope, stood the ranger station. I put on a final burst of speed, my hand already fumbling for the keys on my belt. I slammed into the door, my shaking hands struggling to find the right key. Behind me, I could hear the creature slowing, approaching with an almost casual gait now. It knew I was trapped. Finally, the key slid home. I wrenched the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut just as a massive form collided with it from the other side. The whole cabin shook with the impact. I scrambled to lock the door, then backed away, my eyes fixed on the windows. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a scraping sound as claws dragged slowly down the wooden door. "Open up, little ranger!" a voice growled from outside. It was deep, guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but it was undeniably a voice. "You can't hide in there forever!" I pressed myself into a corner, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist. They couldn't exist, but as I huddled there in the dark, listening to that thing circling the cabin, testing for weaknesses, I knew that everything I thought I understood about the world had changed, and I prayed that Mike and Dave would get here soon, because I had a sinking feeling that a wooden cabin wasn't going to hold this creature back for long. As if in answer to my thoughts, I heard a splintering crack as one of the window frames began to give way under the creature's assault. All I could do now was wait and hope that help would arrive before those claws found their way to me. The night was far from over, and I had a feeling it was about to get a whole lot worse. Story 2. The first wood knock echoed through the forest like a gunshot, stopping us dead in our tracks. My friend Jake and I exchanged worried glances, our breaths visible in the chilly mountain air. That sound wasn't made by any normal forest creature. It was deliberate, almost human-like, yet far too powerful. Little did we know, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would push us to the very limits of survival and sanity. My name's Alex, and I've been an avid hiker for most of my life. I thought I'd seen it all on the trails, from bears to mountain lions to the occasional ill-prepared tourist, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered on that fateful day in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. It had started as a routine weekend hike. Jake and I had decided to tackle a challenging trail that wound its way up one of the lesser-known peaks in the area. We'd set out early, our backpacks laden with supplies for an overnight camp at the summit. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with a hint of autumn in the air. The trouble started late in the afternoon. We should have been nearing the summit, but the trail markers had become increasingly sparse, and the path itself was overgrown and barely visible in places. I had a sinking feeling in my gut that we'd somehow strayed off course. Jake," I said, stopping to pull out our map. "I think we might be lost." He came to stand beside me, peering at the map over my shoulder. "No way, man. We've been following the trail markers all day." I shook my head, pointing to where I thought we were. "Look, we should be seeing the summit by now, but all I see are more trees. I think we missed a turn somewhere back there." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but that's when we heard it. The knock. It was loud, resonating through the trees with an unnatural clarity. We both froze, our argument forgotten. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, his eyes scanning the dense forest around us. I shook my head slowly, my mouth suddenly dry. "I don't know. Maybe a woodpecker." Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. No woodpecker could produce a sound that loud or that distinct. It had sounded more like someone striking a tree trunk with a baseball bat. We stood in silence for a long moment, straining our ears. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if all the wildlife was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere off to our right, came an answering knock. This one was closer, loud enough to make us both jump. "Okay," Jake said, his voice tight with tension. "That's not normal. We need to get out of here." I nodded, hastily shoving the map back into my pocket. "Agreed. Let's head back the way we came. We must have missed a turn somewhere." We set off at a brisk pace, our earlier fatigue forgotten in the face of this new, unsettling development. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, had me whipping my head around, searching for the source. The knocking continued, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right. It seemed to be keeping pace with us, always just out of sight, and it wasn't alone. As the light began to fade, we started hearing other sounds. Heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, low grunts that were almost, but not quite, human. "Alex!" Jake hissed, grabbing my arm. "Look!" He was pointing at the ground. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint. But it wasn't like any print I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with 5 distinct toe impressions. It looked almost human, but the size and the strange elongation of the toes made that impossible. "What the hell made that?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper, his face pale in the fading light. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Bigfoot. It seemed absurd, the stuff of cheesy documentaries and conspiracy theories, but standing there, looking at that massive footprint, I couldn't think of any other explanation. A twig snapped loudly behind us, and we both spun around. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of something large moving. It was there and gone in an instant, but the image burned itself into my brain. A massive, hair-covered figure, walking upright like a man. "Run!" I gasped out, grabbing Jake's arm. "Run!" We took off, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail or our direction. All that mattered was putting distance between us and whatever was out there. The light was fading fast now, the forest around us transforming into a maze of shadows and looming shapes. The sounds followed us, wood knocks, grunts, the crash of something large moving through the forest. It seemed to be coming from all around us, as if we were being herded. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever these things were, they were intelligent. They were working together, using strategy to drive us in a specific direction. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Finally, gasping for breath, we stumbled to a stop in a small clearing. Night had fallen completely now. The forest around us pitch black, except for the weak light of the crescent moon filtering through the canopy. "We can't keep running blind," I panted, fumbling in my backpack for my flashlight. "We need to figure out where we are," Jake nodded, too out of breath to speak. He pulled out his own light, and we quickly scanned our surroundings. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. There was no sign of a trail. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to stay calm and think this through. They haven't attacked us outright, so maybe they're just curious. If we can make it until morning, we can find our way back to the main trail." Jake nodded, his face ghostly in the harsh beam of the flashlight. "Yeah, okay, we've got supplies. We can make camp here. Try to—" He broke off suddenly, his eyes widening as he stared at something over my shoulder. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. In the dim light, I could make out powerfully muscled arms that hung almost to its knees, and a head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders with no discernible neck. But it was the eyes that captured my attention. They reflected the light of our flashlights, glowing an eerie, yellowish green. And they were undeniably intelligent, studying us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature raised one massive hand and pointed deeper into the forest. The message was clear: "Go that way." "Alex," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "What do we do?" I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this impossible creature as I could. But another part of me, the part that had gotten us this far, knew that running was pointless. Whatever these things were, they knew these woods far better than we did. They could easily run us to exhaustion. "We do what it wants," I said finally, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "We go where it's pointing." Jake looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you crazy? We can't just follow it." "We don't have a choice," I hissed back. "Look around. There are more of them." As if on cue, we heard movement from the trees surrounding the clearing. More massive shapes emerged, their eyes glowing in the darkness. We were completely surrounded. Slowly, keeping our movements deliberate and non-threatening, we started walking in the direction the first creature had indicated. As we passed it, I couldn't help but stare. Up close, the mix of human and ape-like features was even more unsettling. Its face was flatter than a gorilla's, with a pronounced brow and a mouth that seemed capable of speech. But there was nothing human about the raw power evident in its massive frame. We walked for what felt like hours, our strange escorts keeping pace on either side of us, always just visible in the periphery of our flashlight beams. The forest grew denser, the terrain more rugged. Several times, I was sure we were going to stumble off a cliff in the darkness, but each time one of the creatures would grunt or knock on a tree, steering us in a safer direction. Finally, we emerged into another clearing, this one much larger than the first. In the center stood an enormous old-growth tree, its trunk easily 20 feet in diameter, and carved into that trunk was an opening, a doorway into the hollow heart of the tree. The creatures stopped at the edge of the clearing, their intent clear. This was our destination. Jake and I exchanged glances. The fear was still there, but it had been largely replaced by a sense of awe and disbelief. We were about to step into a world that shouldn't exist, guided by creatures that defied everything we thought we knew about nature and evolution. As we approached the tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives were about to change forever. Whatever waited for us inside that tree, whatever these creatures wanted from us, one thing was certain. We were a long way from the lost hikers we'd been just hours ago. We were now witnesses to something extraordinary, something that would challenge our understanding of the world. With a deep breath, we stepped through the doorway and into the unknown. Story 3. The scream that tore through the night wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something in between, a sound that didn't belong in this world, and it was coming from just beyond the reach of our campfire's light. That's when I knew our weekend of fun and scary stories had turned into something far more terrifying than we could have ever imagined. My name's Mike, and I've been camping in these woods since I was a kid. I thought I knew every sound, every creature that called this forest home, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that night. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Me and 4 of my closest friends, Sarah, Tom, Jess, and Alex, had planned this trip for months. We'd found the perfect spot, deep in the national forest, far from the usual campsites and tourist trails. We wanted solitude, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. The day had been perfect. We'd hiked in, set up our tents, and spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding woods. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, cracking open beers and roasting marshmallows. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the occasional spooky story. It was Tom who suggested we up the ante on the ghost stories. "Come on, guys," he said, his face eerily lit by the flickering firelight. "Let's see who can tell the scariest tale. Winner gets to sleep in tomorrow, while the rest of us make breakfast." We all agreed enthusiastically. Sarah went first, spinning a pretty good yarn about a haunted cabin. Alex followed with a classic alien abduction story. Jess told a creepy urban legend that had us all checking the shadows behind us. Then it was my turn. I'd saved my best story for last. A local legend about a creature that was said to roam these very woods. "And did they say it's not quite human, not quite animal?" I began, lowering my voice for effect. "The old-timers call it the Wendigo. It's said to stand over 8 feet tall, with the head of a deer and the body of a man, and it hungers for human flesh." I was just getting to the good part when we heard it, that scream. It started low, almost like a moan, before rising to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all froze, the marshmallow on Jess's stick slowly catching fire. Forgotten. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the campfire and our own ragged breathing. "What the hell was that?" Tom whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I shook my head slowly, my mouth suddenly dry. "I don't know. Maybe a mountain lion." Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I'd heard mountain lions before, and this was something else entirely. We sat in tense silence, straining our ears for any further sounds. The forest around us had gone unnaturally quiet, as if all the usual nighttime creatures were holding their breath. "Maybe we should pack up," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "Head back to the car." I was about to agree when Alex spoke up. "Guys, look." He was pointing at something just beyond the circle of our firelight. "What is that?" We all turned to look. At first, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a footprint. but not like any footprint I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with long, claw-like toes clearly visible in the soft earth. That's not possible, Jess breathed, her face pale in the firelight. I stood up slowly, grabbing a flashlight from my pack. "Stay here," I told the others. "I'm going to take a closer look." Ignoring their protests, I stepped towards the edge of our campsite. The beam of my flashlight illuminated more prints. A clear trail leading off into the darkness. They alternated between two-legged and four-legged gaits, as if whatever made them couldn't decide if it wanted to walk like a man or an animal. I was so focused on the tracks that I almost missed it, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. I swung my flashlight around, heart pounding in my chest. For just a second, I caught a glimpse of something. A tall, dark figure, moving with unnatural speed between the trees. It was there and gone so quickly, I could have convinced myself I'd imagined it, except for the eyes. In that brief moment, I saw eyes reflecting the light of my flashlight, glowing an eerie yellowish green, eyes that were far too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest animal. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight in my haste to get back to the safety of the campfire. "We need to leave," I gasped out. "Now!" The others didn't argue. We scrambled to gather our essentials, leaving the tents and most of our gear behind. All that mattered was getting back to the car as quickly as possible. That's when we made a horrifying discovery. Tom had driven us here, and he kept the keys in his jacket pocket. The jacket he'd carelessly tossed into his tent earlier in the evening. The tent that was now empty, the jacket nowhere to be found. "It's okay," Sarah said, her voice higher than usual with barely contained panic. We'll hike out. We can make it back to the ranger station by morning if we leave now." It was a good plan. The only plan, really. But as we gathered in a tight group, flashlights scanning the darkness around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever was out there in the forest was toying with us, herding us exactly where it wanted us to go. We set off down the trail, moving as quickly as we dared in the darkness. The sound started again almost immediately, wood knocks echoing through the trees, heavy footsteps paralleling our path, always just out of sight, and that scream, that terrible otherworldly scream, seeming to come from all around us. "It's just trying to scare us," Alex muttered, though whether he was trying to convince us or himself, I couldn't tell. "We just need to keep moving." But it was more than just scare tactics. As we hurried down the trail, I began to notice things, broken branches at head height, as if something very tall had passed through, deep claw marks on tree trunks, and once, horribly, what looked like a clump of coarse, dark hair caught on a low-hanging branch. The worst part was the growing certainty that we weren't going the right way. The trail should have been leading us down the mountain, back towards civilization. But it felt like we were moving deeper into the wilderness, the forest growing denser and more primeval with every step. After what felt like hours of terrified flight, we burst into a clearing, and there, in the center, stood something that stopped us dead in our tracks. It was a crude structure, made of branches and animal hides stretched over a frame of bones, bones that looked disturbingly human. "Oh, God," Jess whimpered. "Oh, God, oh, God." I felt the same panic rising in my throat, threatening to overwhelm me. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. They were stories, legends, not something you stumbled across in the woods on a camping trip. A twig snapped loudly behind us, and we all spun around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure that defied description. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its body a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. Matted fur covered its powerful frame, and atop its shoulders sat a head that was neither fully human nor fully deer, but some horrifying combination of both. And its eyes, those same yellowish-green eyes I'd seen earlier, now fixed on us with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. For a long moment, nobody moved. We stood frozen in terror, unable to process what we were seeing. The creature regarded us silently, its head tilting slightly as if curious about our reaction. Then, slowly, Deliberately, it raised one massive, clawed hand and pointed deeper into the forest. The message was clear: go that way or face the consequences. I looked at my friends, saw the same mix of terror and disbelief on their faces that I knew must be on mine. We were trapped, lost in a forest that suddenly seemed alien and hostile, confronted by a creature that shouldn't exist. As we turned to follow the creature's silent command, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted from us, one thing was certain: our world had changed forever. The cozy certainties of our everyday lives had been shattered, replaced by a reality where monsters were real and the darkness held terrors beyond our wildest imagination. We ventured deeper into the unknown, our flashlights cutting weak paths through the darkness, the creature's heavy footsteps following close behind. What awaited us, I couldn't begin to guess, but I knew that if we survived this night, we would never be the same again. The campfire tales of our youth had become all too real, and we were living a horror story with no clear end in sight. Story 4. There's a certain silence that blankets the forest at night, but it's not peaceful. It's the kind of quiet that fills you with unease, like the world around you is holding its breath. As a park ranger, you get used to the woods being alive with sound, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, the occasional snap of a branch under a deer's hoof. But tonight was different. Tonight, the woods felt wrong, and I was alone. I had just finished my routine rounds and was heading back to the ranger station when I heard it, a howl. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't the high-pitched yip of a coyote or the mournful call of a wolf. This was deeper, longer, like the earth itself was howling. My gut reaction was to freeze. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn back, to head straight to the station and lock the door behind me. But I was a ranger. I'd been trained to handle wild animals, to assess dangerous situations. So, against my better judgment, I turned in the direction of the howl. The forest closed in around me as I moved off the main trail. My flashlight cut through the trees, casting long shadows that danced and flickered as I moved deeper into the woods. I told myself it was just an animal. Wolves had been spotted in this area before, as maybe it was a lone one, calling out for its pack. But something about that howl, something about the way it reverberated through the trees didn't sit right. I followed the noise for about 10 minutes, weaving through dense underbrush, the beam of my flashlight flicking across the gnarled trunks of the trees, and then I saw it. Claw marks, deep, jagged lines torn into the bark of a tree, about 7 feet off the ground. Whatever made those marks was big, really big. I ran my fingers over the gouges, fresh. The wood underneath was still pale and splintered. My heart started to race as I scanned the area. That primal fear, the kind that creeps up your spine and takes hold, began to settle in my chest. I wasn't alone out here. Something had been through this area recently, something far bigger than anything I was prepared to deal with. I stepped back from the tree, my ears straining to pick up any sign of movement, any sound that would tell me I wasn't about to be ambushed. But there was nothing, just that unsettling quiet. I keyed my radio, hoping for a response. Base, this is Ranger Adams. I'm out near Sector 3, heard something strange and found some large claw marks. Has anyone else reported anything tonight? Static. I tapped the radio again, adjusting the frequency. Base, do you copy? More static. That wasn't normal. The radios were supposed to have excellent range out here. I should have been able to reach someone. My pulse quickened as I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was just a dead zone. I'd come across a few in the past. No need to panic. That's when I heard it again, the howl. But this time, it was closer, much closer. I spun around, flashlight searching the trees, but the beam caught nothing but shadows. The sound seemed to echo, bouncing off the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. I stood frozen, listening, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for the next noise, the next clue that would tell me which direction to run. Then, A twig snapped behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight beam quivered in my hand as I scanned the area. My breath was shallow, each exhale clouding in the cold night air. For a moment, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears, and then I saw it. Eyes. Glowing, yellow eyes. Just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. They were low at first, close to the ground like an animal crouched in the brush. But then, slowly, they rose. Whatever it was, it stood up. On two legs. My heart stopped. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, covered in matted fur. Its body was thick, muscular, but its head was wrong. The long, snouted face of a dog, with sharp, pointed ears that twitched as it listened. It stared at me, those yellow eyes unblinking, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I'd heard the stories. Other rangers had mentioned sightings, half jokingly, half seriously, of creatures in the woods, of things that weren't quite human, but weren't exactly animals either. I'd brushed them off, figured they were just trying to spook the new guy. But standing there, looking into those eyes, I realized the stories were real. The creature tilted its head, almost like it was curious, and then it took a step toward me. My legs finally kicked into gear, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My flashlight dropped to the ground, plunging the woods into darkness, but I didn't need to see it to know it was still there. I could hear it breathing, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. When I finally managed to click it back on, the beam landed on empty forest. The creature was gone. I stood there, panting, flashlight shaking in my grip, scanning the trees. The woods were still deathly quiet, but I could feel it, that sense of being watched, of being hunted. It was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of my light. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I needed to get out of here. Slowly, I started backing away, keeping the flashlight trained on the trees in front of me. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was out there. Watching, waiting. I'd made it about 20 feet when I heard something. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. They weren't running. They didn't need to. Whatever this thing was, it knew it could catch me whenever it wanted. The radio crackled to life in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Adams! This is base! Come in!" I grabbed the radio, fumbling with the button. "Base! This is Adams! The footsteps stopped. The growling had stopped, too. I'm in Sector 3. I found some tracks. Something big. I don't know what it is, but it's not a wolf, and it's..." A low snarl cut through the night air. It was closer now, so close I could almost feel the breath on the back of my neck. I ran. Branches whipped against my face as I tore through the trees, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The footsteps followed me, slow and steady, always just behind, never rushing. It was toying with me. I could see the faint glow of the ranger station up ahead. I just needed to make it a little farther, a little faster. The growling was right on top of me now, and I could hear the snap of jaws just behind my ear. I pushed harder, the station's lights growing brighter, closer. I burst out of the trees and stumbled toward the building, slamming into the door and yanking it open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I collapsed against the wall, listening, waiting for the sound of claws on the wood, for the door to shake under the weight of the creature, but it never came. The night outside was eerily quiet again. I stood there, heart pounding, every muscle in my body still tense, waiting for the attack that never came. I walked to the window, flashlight still in hand, and peered out into the darkness. The trees stood still, casting long shadows under the moonlight. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the dark, the isolation, the stories had all gotten to me. And then I saw them. Glowing yellow eyes staring back at me from the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the light. It was still out there, and it was waiting. Story 5. I always considered myself an experienced hiker, someone who knew the mountains like the back of my hand. But there are places, even in the most familiar landscapes, that can make you feel small, insignificant. It was late afternoon when I stumbled upon it, an old, forgotten cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from any trail or marked path. The kind of place that shouldn't exist. Not out here, not this deep. I didn't plan on finding it. I was out on one of my longer hikes, exploring a remote section of the mountain range I hadn't been through in years. The air was crisp, the scent of pine hanging heavy in the cool breeze. I was miles from any other people, and that's just how I liked it. Solitude had a way of resetting the mind, helping you shake off the stress of everyday life. But that day, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I realized I'd wandered farther than I meant to. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, something half buried in the trees, a shadow that didn't quite belong. But as I got closer, I saw the structure, a small, crooked cabin tucked between the trees, like it had grown out of the earth itself. The wood was dark, nearly black with age, and the roof sagged as if it hadn't been touched in decades, a place forgotten by time. I stood there, staring at it, an uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It wasn't marked on any of my maps, and I'd never heard anyone mention a cabin out this way. The windows were dark, no signs of life, no smoke curling from a chimney. It was just there. My first instinct was to leave it alone, to turn back and pretend I hadn't seen it. But curiosity got the better of me. I reasoned that it was probably an old hunting cabin, abandoned long ago. Maybe I could get a better sense of where I was, figure out if there was an old logging trail nearby that I could follow back. I walked up to the door, its surface rough and splintered, the wood weathered from countless seasons of rain and snow. The handle, rusted and cold to the touch, gave way easily. The door creaked open with a sound that sent a shiver through me, like the cabin was reluctant to let anyone in. Inside, it was dark and musty. The air was thick with the scent of rot and damp wood. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the dirty windows, and I took in the scene. The floor was covered in dust, undisturbed for who knows how long. But that wasn't what made me stop in my tracks. In the far corner of the room, there was a pile. At first, I thought it was a stack of firewood or maybe debris from the roof. But as I moved closer, my stomach twisted. It wasn't firewood. It was bones, dozens of them, maybe more, stacked in a crude, haphazard pile. Animal bones, I told myself, but that didn't make it any better. They were old, brittle, some still wrapped in bits of dried sinew. The skull of a deer lay on top, its antlers twisted and broken, but there were others too, smaller bones, scattered around the base of the pile, as if they'd been tossed aside. My heart started to race. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too cramped, like the walls were closing in. I backed away, my mind racing with questions. Who would collect these? Why? The logical part of me tried to reason it out. Maybe a hunter had used this place as a storage site. Maybe they were remnants from a long-forgotten hunt, but something about it felt off. I turned to leave, the growing sense of unease telling me it was time to get out of there, fast. But as I reached for the door, I heard it, a sound, faint at first, like a low rumble in the distance. My hand froze on the doorknob as I listened, straining to make out what it was. Breathing, heavy, deliberate breathing. I whipped around, eyes scanning the dim room, searching for the source. But the cabin was still empty. At least, it looked empty. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was the wind, or maybe my own breathing echoing in the tight space. But deep down, I knew better. The sound wasn't coming from inside the cabin. It was outside. I slowly opened the door, heart hammering in my chest, and stepped out into the fading light. The woods were quiet, too quiet. That eerie silence had settled in, the kind where you can almost hear your own heartbeat. I looked around, scanning the tree line for any movement, but everything was still. That's when I saw them. Tracks, large, deep impressions in the earth, leading up from the side of the cabin and into the woods. They were fresh and far too big to belong to any animal I knew of in these parts. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear, maybe. But no, these prints were different, wider, with what looked like elongated toes, almost human, but wrong. I didn't wait to find out more. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from that cabin as I could. I turned and started back down the trail, quickening my pace, the back of my neck prickling with the sensation of being watched. The woods seemed darker now, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched between the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something just out of sight, following me as I made my way back toward where I thought the trail should be. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, a figure, a shadow, anything. But the woods remained empty, and yet that sound, the breathing, seemed to follow me, always just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint it. As I pushed deeper into the forest, my sense of direction started to waver. The trees all looked the same, the underbrush thicker than I remembered. I stopped, panting, trying to calm myself, trying to think clearly. I knew these woods. I knew how to get out, but when I looked back, the cabin was gone. It had vanished into the trees, swallowed up by the forest. I couldn't even see the path I'd taken to get there. My stomach twisted into knots. How had I gotten so turned around? The breathing grew louder, closer. I started moving again, faster this time, my pulse racing in my ears. I wasn't sure where I was going anymore, just that I needed to keep moving. My legs ached, branches scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. Not until I heard it, the snap of a branch behind me. I froze, turning slowly, flashlight in hand, shining it through the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty forest. But then, just for a split second, I saw it. A figure, tall, broad, covered in thick, dark hair. It stood just at the edge of the trees, watching me, its eyes reflecting the light in a way that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it wasn't human. Its shoulders were too wide, its posture too hunched. And the way it moved, slow, deliberate, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I bolted, my feet pounding against the forest floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing followed, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare see how close it had gotten. My only thought was to run, to get away, to survive. I could hear its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, keeping pace with me no matter how fast I ran. The ground beneath me was uneven, and more than once I stumbled, nearly falling as my body screamed for me to stop, to rest. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I burst through the trees into a clearing, my heart pounding in my throat. For a moment, I thought I'd made it, thought I'd lost it. But then I heard that breathing again, louder this time, just behind me. I turned, flashlight trembling in my hand, and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with those reflective eyes, its hulking form barely visible in the fading light. It didn't move, didn't come closer. It just stood there, as if waiting, as if daring me to come back. I didn't. I ran until my legs gave out, until the trees thinned and the sound of the creature's footsteps faded into the distance. When I finally reached the trailhead, my chest was heaving, my clothes soaked with sweat, but I didn't stop until I was safe inside my car. I haven't been back to those woods since. The cabin still haunts my thoughts, its shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, but it's the thing in the woods, the creature that followed me, that keeps me awake at night, because I know it's still out there. And one day, someone else is going to find that cabin. And this time, they might not be so lucky. Story 6. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It hit me like a physical force as I squeezed through the narrow opening, the stench of decay, of old death and something else, something I couldn't quite place. but it was that unknown element that sent a chill down my spine, a primal warning that I was entering a place where I didn't belong. If only I'd listened to that instinct, I might have avoided the terror that awaited me in the depths of that forgotten cave. My name is Dr. Evelyn Carter, and I'm a spelunker and archaeologist specializing in prehistoric cave art. I've explored caves all over the world, from the famous paintings of Lascaux to remote caverns in the Australian outback. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in that remote cave system in northern Canada. It had started as a routine expedition. A local hunting guide had stumbled across the cave entrance while tracking moose, and initial surveys suggested it might contain undiscovered cave paintings. My team and I had flown in, excited at the prospect of a major find. The first few days were uneventful. We set up base camp near the cave entrance and began our initial explorations. The cave system was extensive, with numerous chambers and winding passages. We found a few examples of primitive art, handprints, abstract symbols, but nothing extraordinary. It was on the fourth day that things changed. I was exploring a narrow side passage, having to crawl on my stomach in places to squeeze through. The air was getting thinner, and I was about to turn back when my headlamp illuminated something ahead that made me pause. The passage opened up into a small chamber, and on the far wall I could see paintings, but these were unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. The images were crude but powerful, depicting tall, emaciated figures with elongated limbs and antler-like protrusions from their heads. They were shown hunting, not animals, but what appeared to be humans. I felt a chill run down my spine as I studied the images. There was something profoundly unsettling about them, a sense of malevolence that seemed to radiate from the cave walls. But as an archaeologist, I was also thrilled. This could be a major discovery, evidence of a previously unknown prehistoric cult or belief system. I took out my camera and began documenting the paintings, my excitement momentarily overriding my unease. It wasn't until I reviewed the images on my camera's screen that I noticed something odd. In the background of one of the photos, barely visible in the shadows, was what looked like a pile of bones. Frowning, I turned my headlamp in that direction. Sure enough, tucked into a corner of the chamber was a heap of what I initially took to be animal bones. But as I approached for a closer look, my blood ran cold. These weren't animal remains. The skull staring up at me from the top of the pile was unmistakably human. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. This wasn't right. These bones shouldn't be here. They looked old, but not ancient, certainly not as old as the paintings. Had someone else found this cave before us? Was this some kind of sick joke? That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the depths of a cave. A low, raspy breathing, echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system. It was faint, but unmistakable, and it was getting louder. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that chamber and back to the safety of my team. But the scientist in me, the part that had driven me to explore the darkest corners of the earth, held me in place. I had to know what was making that sound. Slowly, hesitantly, I moved towards the back of the chamber, where a dark opening led deeper into the cave. The breathing was louder now, interspersed with a strange clicking sound that set my teeth on edge. My headlamp seemed woefully inadequate, the beams swallowed up by the oppressive darkness ahead. I was about to step through the opening when my light caught something on the ground. I looked down and felt my heart skip a beat. There, pressed into the soft clay of the cave floor, was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long, claw-like toes that dug deep into the earth. I stood frozen, staring at that impossible print. In that moment, all my scientific training, all my rational explanations crumbled away. The paintings on the wall, the pile of bones, that unearthly breathing, it all came together in a revelation that shook me to my core. The creature depicted in those ancient paintings wasn't a myth or a legend. It was real, and it was still here. As if in response to my thoughts, the breathing suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. Then from the darkness ahead came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. A low, guttural growl that was neither human nor animal, but something horrifyingly in between. I didn't consciously decide to run. One moment I was standing there, paralyzed with fear, and the next I was scrambling back through the narrow passage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear something moving behind me, something large forcing its way through the tight confines of the cave. I burst out of the passage into the larger chamber where my team was working, shouting incoherently about the need to leave, now. They stared at me in confusion, clearly thinking I'd been overcome by claustrophobia or bad air. "Evelyn, calm down," my assistant, Tom, said, reaching for me. "What's wrong? What did you see?" Before I could answer, a roar echoed through the cave, so loud it sent rocks clattering from the ceiling. The color drained from my team's faces as they realized this was no delusion. "Run!" I screamed, already heading for the cave entrance. "Everyone out now!" We ran like we'd never run before, our headlamps bobbing wildly, casting frantic shadows on the cave walls. I could hear it behind us, moving with impossible speed through passages it should have been too large to navigate. The sound of its pursuit was punctuated by that same terrible roar, the cry of a predator closing in on its prey. We burst out of the cave into the fading daylight, gasping for breath. "The jeep," Tom panted. "And we need to get to the jeep." But as we turned towards our vehicle, parked about 100 yards from the cave entrance, my heart sank. Between us and our escape stood a figure that defied description. It was tall, impossibly tall, its emaciated body covered in patches of coarse dark hair. Its limbs were elongated, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, a horrifying blend of human and deer features, with glowing eyes that fixed us with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. For a long moment, nobody moved. We stood frozen in terror, unable to process what we were seeing. The creature regarded us silently, its head tilting slightly as if curious about our reaction. Then slowly it began to move towards us with a grace that belied its ungainly appearance. "Scatter!" I yelled, breaking the spell. "Don't let it herd you back into the cave." We broke in different directions, running for the cover of the surrounding forest. I sprinted harder than I ever had in my life, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear the creature behind me, its breathing harsh and excited, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush with terrifying speed. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but the fear kept me going, the primal terror of being hunted driving me forward. Finally, I burst through the tree line onto the dirt road where we'd left our second vehicle. By some miracle, the keys were still in the ignition. I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling to start the engine with shaking hands. As the engine roared to life, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. There, at the edge of the forest, stood the creature. It made no move to approach, simply watching me with those glowing eyes. As I slammed the Jeep into gear and peeled out onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was letting me go, that this had all been some kind of test, or worse, a game. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. It wasn't until I was in a brightly lit diner, a cup of coffee warming my shaking hands, that I allowed myself to break down. I wept for my lost colleagues, for the terror we'd experienced, for the knowledge that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. In the days that followed, as search and rescue teams combed the area, finding no trace of my team or the creature, I was left with a choice. Do I tell the world what I saw, risking my reputation and career? Or do I stay silent, knowing that others might stumble upon that cave, unaware of the horror that lurks in its depths? In the end, I chose to speak out. Few believe me, of course. But if my story prevents even one person from experiencing the terror I faced in that cave, it will have been worth it. because now I know the truth. The legends are real, and some dark corners of the world are best left unexplored. Story 7. I'd always loved the cold. There's something about the stillness of a frozen wilderness that makes you feel like the only person in the world. It's silent, isolated, untouchable. But that night, stranded in the middle of nowhere as the wind howled like a pack of starving wolves, I learned that the cold can be more than just lonely. It can be deadly, and it can bring things with it, things that no one talks about, things you don't believe in until it's too late. We weren't supposed to be out there. The weather had turned quicker than expected, and we'd pushed too far into the mountains. The three of us, me, Jakes, and Luke, were experienced snowmobilers, but even we weren't prepared for the blizzard that came crashing down on us without warning. One minute we were racing along the ridge, laughing and joking over the radio. The next, we were swallowed by white, visibility down to nothing. It didn't take long for the cold to set in, gnawing at our fingers, freezing the breath in our lungs. The snow was coming down so thick it felt like we were drowning in it. We had no choice but to find shelter. Luke was the one who spotted the cabin, a small, crooked structure barely visible through the storm, half buried in snowdrifts. It wasn't much, but it was better than being out in the open. We parked the snowmobiles outside and hurried in, grateful for the momentary break from the biting wind. The cabin was old, really old. The wood was rotting, and the windows were covered in frost so thick we couldn't see through them. But it was solid enough. A fireplace sat unused in the corner, and there were a couple of musty old blankets thrown across a rickety table. "Better than freezing to death out there," Jake muttered, dropping his pack on the floor and brushing snow from his jacket. "Barely," I said, casting a glance at the sagging ceiling. Luke was already digging through his gear, setting up a small propane stove to heat some water. "We'll wait it out here," he said. "Storm should pass by morning, and then we can figure out how to get back." It sounded like a plan, and for a while, everything felt manageable. The three of us huddled together, passing around a flask of whiskey, trying to stay warm, while the wind rattled the cabin like it wanted to rip it apart. Outside, the storm screamed, and every now and then the wind would let out this low, eerie whistle, like something calling from far off in the distance. But as the hours dragged on, that whistle started to get to me. It wasn't just the wind. It couldn't be. The sound was too deliberate, too alive. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But every time the wind howled, that whistle followed, faint but persistent, like something was out there, moving through the storm. "You guys hear that?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. My voice sounded too loud in the small space. "Hear what?" Jake grunted, taking a sip from the flask. "That whistling. It sounds like, I don't know, like someone's out there." Luke looked up from the stove, frowning. "It's just the wind. Don't let it get to you." I nodded, but the uneasy feeling in my chest didn't go away. I glanced at the frost-covered windows again, feeling a strange pull, like I needed to look outside to see if something was really out there. My gut twisted in knots, a sense of dread crawling under my skin. But I stayed put, telling myself that the isolation and the storm were getting to me. An hour passed, maybe two. We took turns trying to sleep, but none of us could settle. The storm didn't let up, and that damned whistling just wouldn't stop. It was around midnight when things started to get really strange. Jake was pacing near the door, muttering about the cold, when he froze mid-step, his face going pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered, staring at the window. I turned to look, my heart pounding. "See what? Out there!" He pointed, his hand trembling slightly. "I swear I saw something moving past the window." I got up slowly, my legs feeling heavy. The window was still coated in a thick layer of frost, impossible to see through, but there was something about Jake's expression that made my blood run cold. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but right now, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Luke grabbed the flashlight from his pack and moved toward the door. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said, though his voice was tight. "I'll check it out." "Don't," I said, suddenly filled with a deep, gut-wrenching sense of wrongness. "Let's just stay inside." Luke hesitated, his hand on the door handle. The wind outside roared, and that faint, eerie whistle drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls again, more insistent this time, more alive. He pulled the door open before I could stop him, stepping out into the storm with the flashlight beam cutting through the snow. I held my breath, waiting for him to say something, to laugh it off, to tell us it was just our imagination. But he didn't. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm, the wind howling through the trees, and then the scream. It was a sharp, high-pitched scream, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It didn't sound human. It was this awful, guttural wail, like something in agony, something starving. The kind of sound that makes your blood freeze in your veins. Luke stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut, his face white as snow. "We need to leave. Now," he gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. Luke didn't answer. He just stared at the door, his eyes wide with fear. "There's something out there, something big. I couldn't see it clearly, but it's not an animal. It's something else." I felt the cabin grow smaller, the air thicker, like something was pressing down on us. My chest tightened, and my mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. "What do you mean, something else? What did you see?" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair, still staring at the door. "I don't know. It was tall, taller than any man, with these eyes, these glowing yellow eyes. It was just standing out there in the storm, watching me." A heavy silence fell over the cabin, the only sound the wind battering the walls. We were trapped. The storm was too strong to leave, but staying in the cabin didn't feel any safer. I glanced at the frost-covered windows again, my heart hammering in my chest. That whistling, it wasn't the wind. It had never been the wind. And then, suddenly, the whistling stopped. Jake stood up, grabbing his rifle from his pack. "We're not just going to sit here and wait for whatever that thing is to come for us." He moved toward the window, wiping away some of the frost with the sleeve of his jacket. His eyes narrowed as he peered out into the storm. "What do you see?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. He didn't answer for a long moment, just stood there, frozen, his breath fogging the glass. And then he whispered, "It's closer." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" Jake stepped back from the window, his face pale. "It's standing right there, just at the edge of the clearing. It's watching us." I moved to the window, my heart in my throat. Sure enough, through the remaining frost, I could just make out a shape, a tall, hulking figure, barely visible through the swirling snow. Its eyes glowed faintly, yellow and hungry, locked onto the cabin. None of us moved. We were too terrified to even breathe. The wind outside picked up, howling like a living thing, and the figure stepped closer, its massive form barely distinguishable through the storm. "We can't stay here," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "It's coming for us." "What the hell is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the wind. Jake shook his head. "Wendigo, it has to be." I didn't want to believe him. I didn't want to believe in any of it. But as the figure moved closer, its unnatural eyes fixed on the cabin, I knew he was right. This wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was something much worse, something ancient, something hungry. The door rattled on its hinges as the storm raged outside, and I felt the weight of it, the thing lurking in the snow, waiting for its chance. "Grab everything," I said, my voice hoarse. "We're getting out of here." But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The Wendigo wasn't going to let us leave, and there was nowhere left to run. Story 8. The scratching at my window wasn't what woke me. It was the silence that came after, the unnatural quiet that fell over the woods like a shroud, as if every creature for miles around was holding its breath. In that moment, lying in the darkness of my cabin, I knew with bone-deep certainty that something was out there, something that didn't belong in this world. My name is Lily, and until that night, I thought I knew solitude. I'd moved to this remote cabin in the Adirondacks 6 months ago, seeking escape from the chaos of city life and a messy divorce. I wanted peace, quiet, a chance to write the novel I'd been putting off for years. What I got instead was a front-row seat to a nightmare. The day had started normally enough. I'd woken at dawn, made coffee, and spent the morning working on my book. After lunch, I'd gone for a hike, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the vibrant colors of the changing leaves. It wasn't until I was heading back to the cabin that I first sensed something was off. The woods had gone quiet. Not the peaceful quiet I'd grown accustomed to, but an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to be back within the safe confines of my cabin. As I approached the clearing where my cabin stood, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, in the soft earth near my porch, was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long claw-like toes that dug deep into the ground. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that impossible print, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had to be a bear, I told myself. A very large bear that had somehow learned to walk on its hind legs. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I hurried inside, double-checking that all the doors and windows were securely locked. As night fell, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. I was a city girl, after all, probably just spooked by the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. But as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching the cabin, waiting. The scratching started just after midnight. At first, it was so faint I thought I might be imagining it, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window next to my bed. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the scratching continued. Then, suddenly, it stopped, and that's when the true terror began. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind in the trees, no distant owl hoots, not even the sound of my own breathing. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Slowly, trembling, I reached for the bedside lamp. As my fingers closed around the switch, a shadow fell across the window. Something large was out there, blocking out the moonlight. I flicked on the lamp, and in that instant, I saw it. A massive, hair-covered hand pressed against the glass. The fingers were unnaturally long, ending in curved claws that looked capable of rending flesh from bone. But it was the size that truly terrified me. That hand was easily twice the size of my own, the palm alone covering most of the window pane. I scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. As I backed away from the window, I heard a low, rumbling growl from outside. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, not quite animal, not quite human, but something horrifyingly in between. I ran for the living room, fumbling for my phone. I needed to call for help, to get someone out here. But as I picked up the device, my heart sank. No signal. Of course there was no signal. I was miles from the nearest cell tower, the landline. I still had the landline. I lunged for it, my fingers shaking as I tried to dial 911. But as I raised the receiver to my ear, my blood ran cold. The line was dead, not just no dial tone. It was as if the line had been physically cut. A thud from the porch made me jump. Then another. Heavy footsteps, moving with deliberate slowness around the perimeter of the cabin. It was testing the defenses, looking for a way in. I retreated to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find. It felt pathetically inadequate against whatever was out there, but it was better than nothing. The footsteps stopped at the front door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a sound that turned my blood to ice. The slow turning of the doorknob. I was sure I'd locked it. I always locked it, but the knob was turning, the door slowly opening. I raised the knife, my whole body trembling. In the doorway stood a figure that defied description. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in those terrible clawed hands I'd seen at the window. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. The snout was elongated like a wolf's, filled with teeth that gleamed wickedly in the dim light. But the eyes were disturbingly human-like, filled with an intelligence that no animal should possess. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could hear my own ragged breathing, see the plumes of vapor in the cold night air. The creature's chest rose and fell slowly, calmly. It seemed to be assessing me, deciding what to do. Then, in a move that defied everything I thought I knew about animal behavior, it spoke. The voice was deep, guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but the words were unmistakable. "Put down the knife, little one. You won't be needing it." The knife clattered to the floor from my nerveless fingers. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist. They were stories, legends, not something that showed up at your door in the middle of the night. The creature took a step forward, ducking its head to fit through the doorway. I backed away, my mind reeling, searching desperately for some way out of this nightmare. What are you?" I managed to gasp out. The creature's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile, but on that inhuman face, it was a terrifying sight. I've been called many things over the centuries: Dogman, Wendigo, Skinwalker. But names are unimportant. What matters is why I'm here. It took another step towards me, its claws clicking on the hardwood floor. "You're an outsider here, little one. This forest has rules, ancient rules, and you've broken them." I shook my head, uncomprehending. "I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong." The creature's eyes narrowed. "You've taken without giving back. You've enjoyed the bounty of these woods without offering anything in return. Such imbalance cannot be allowed to continue." It reached out one massive hand, claws extended. "But don't worry, I'm here to restore the balance." In that moment, faced with this impossible creature and its incomprehensible demands, something inside me snapped. The terror that had paralyzed me gave way to a surge of desperate anger. "No," I said, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. "And I don't know what you are or what you want, but you don't belong here. This is my home, and you're not welcome." The creature paused, its head tilting to one side in what might have been surprise. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then, to my utter astonishment, it threw back its head and laughed. The sound was like rocks grinding together, utterly inhuman but undeniably amused. "Well, well," it rumbled. "Perhaps there's more to you than I thought, little one. It's been a long time since a human showed such spirit in the face of the unknown." It lowered its hand, taking a step back. "Very well. You've earned a reprieve. But heed my words. The balance must be maintained. Learn the old ways. Respect the forest and its denizens, or our next meeting will not end so pleasantly." With that, it turned and loped back into the night, leaving me standing in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I packed up and moved back to the city the very next day. But the truth is, I stayed. Something had awakened in me that night, a realization that the world was far stranger and more wondrous than I'd ever imagined. I spent the next months learning everything I could about the legends of the area, about the old ways of living in harmony with the forest. I left offerings at the edge of the woods, spoke words of gratitude for every fish I caught, every berry I picked. And sometimes, on dark nights when the moon is full, I catch a glimpse of a large, shadowy figure moving through the trees. But I'm not afraid anymore. I've learned to respect the ancient rules of the forest, and in doing so, I've found the peace and purpose I was searching for all along. The creature was right about one thing: the balance must be maintained. And now, I'm a part of that balance, a guardian of the old ways in a world that's forgotten the magic and mystery that still lurks in the dark corners of the wilderness. Story 9. I had always loved the quiet of the forest at dusk. That soft glow, just before the sun dipped completely below the horizon, when the world felt still, peaceful. It was one of the reasons I became a park ranger, to be alone in nature, to experience those rare moments of solitude most people never see. But that night, as I followed the overgrown trail into the dense forest, I learned that the quiet can be deceiving. Sometimes it's not peaceful at all. Sometimes it's the kind of quiet that warns you to turn around and get out before it's too late. It started as a routine patrol. There had been reports of strange noises in the park for the past few weeks. Nothing too unusual, just some odd animal sounds at night. People always got spooked when they came up here. They weren't used to the sounds of the wilderness, the way the forest creaked and groaned as it settled in for the night. I figured it was just some campers who didn't know the difference between a fox's scream and a mountain lion's growl. The trail I was on wasn't one that was marked on any of the official maps, and for good reason. It wasn't maintained, overgrown with brush and thorny vines, but I'd been down it a few times before, mostly when I was feeling like I needed a little adventure, or when I wanted to get away from the well-worn paths tourists favored. This time, though, there was a different reason. I couldn't shake the reports. Several people had mentioned hearing something big moving through the trees, something they couldn't see but could feel, like being watched. The more I heard it, the more I found myself thinking about it. I needed to know if there was something out there. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead until they blocked out most of the fading light. My boots crunched through the dead leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. I stopped for a moment, listening. Nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but there was something off about the woods that night. I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone or something was watching me from the shadows. I shook the thought from my head and kept walking. I was too far in to turn back now, and besides, I wasn't about to let some creepy atmosphere get the better of me. The trail twisted and turned, winding deeper into the heart of the forest. I hadn't seen any fresh tracks, no signs of wildlife at all. It was strange. Usually, there'd be deer prints, or at least signs of smaller animals, but the ground was untouched. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves from a passing breeze. Just silence. Then I saw it. A broken branch, about 10 feet off the ground, snapped clean in half. My first thought was that it had been a bear, but the break was too high, too deliberate. I knelt down, running my fingers over the bark. Fresh. Whatever did this had been through here recently. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. I stood up, my eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sound. But that feeling was back, the sensation of being watched. I took a few steps forward, my senses on high alert. The trail ahead was even more overgrown, but something urged me to keep going. I should have turned back, I knew that, but instead I pushed deeper into the forest, my heart pounding harder with each step. The trail seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by the trees, but I kept moving, following the strange pull that had taken hold of me. That's when I heard it. A low, deep grunt, so deep I felt it more than I heard it. I froze. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd just heard. It had to be a bear, I thought, but then I heard it again, closer this time. The sound was too guttural, too unnatural. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. I slowly turned, scanning the forest around me. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, more menacing. I could feel my pulse quickening, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was out there. I could feel it. I took a step back, trying to listen, trying to hear anything that would tell me where the sound had come from. And then I saw it. Movement, just out of the corner of my eye, a massive shape disappearing behind a tree. My breath caught in my throat. It was big, bigger than any animal that should have been out here. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, but I knew better. Whatever it was fast, and if I ran, I'd never make it out. I stayed still, my back pressed against a tree, my hand gripping the handle of my flashlight. I didn't dare turn it on, didn't want to draw attention to myself. The light was fading fast, the shadows growing longer. Another grunt, closer. I could hear it breathing now, slow and deliberate, like it was taking its time. I scanned the trees again, trying to catch a glimpse of it, but it was too dark, too well hidden. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears, and then it stepped out. At first, all I saw was its legs, thick, muscular, covered in dark, matted fur. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if it knew I was watching. Then, as it emerged from the shadows, I saw the rest of it. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, towering over the forest floor. Its body was broad and powerful, like a bear, but it stood upright, walking on 2 legs. Its arms hung low, its hands nearly dragging against the ground. But it was the face that froze me in place. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its eyes were dark and sunken, glowing faintly in the dying light. Its mouth was wide, filled with jagged, yellowed teeth, and its nose was flat, almost ape-like. It stared at me, unblinking, its chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped in its gaze, my body refusing to obey the primal urge to run. The creature let out another deep, rumbling grunt, its nostrils flaring as it inhaled the air between us. It was close enough now that I could smell it, a rancid stench of wet fur and decay that made my stomach turn. I knew then that I was in real danger. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't some wild animal I could scare off with noise or a warning shot. It was intelligent, deliberate, and it was watching me, studying me. Slowly, I backed away, my foot slipping on the uneven ground. The creature's head tilted slightly, watching my every movement. I knew I couldn't run. Not yet. If I made any sudden moves, it would be on me in seconds. I took another step back, keeping my eyes on it, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear it. The creature didn't move, just stood there, its eyes locked on mine. I took one more step, then another, and then without warning it let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the trees. My body moved before I could think. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get out. Branches whipped against my face, my legs burned, but I didn't stop. The sound of heavy footsteps thundered behind me, getting closer, each one shaking the ground beneath my feet. I burst through the trees, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The ranger station was in sight, the lights barely visible through the thickening dark. I pushed myself harder, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see how close it was. The footsteps grew louder, the ground shaking beneath me, but I didn't stop. I was so close now, the station just a few yards away. With one final burst of energy, I threw myself toward the door, slamming into it with all my weight. I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it as fast as I could. My chest heaved, my body trembling, but I was safe. For now, outside, the forest was still. But I knew it was out there, watching, waiting, and I knew it would be back. Story 10. I first noticed the shadow when I was about halfway through the woods. It was just a flicker in my peripheral vision, but it was enough to make me pause mid-step. Something was following me, and it was big, too big to be a normal forest animal. That's when I realized my shortcut home was about to become the longest and most terrifying journey of my life. My name's Jack, and I've lived on the outskirts of Millbrook Forest my entire life. I know these woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. I've taken this shortcut through the forest countless times, usually to get home quickly after late shifts at the diner where I work. But tonight was different. Tonight, the forest felt alive in a way I'd never experienced before. It had been a long, exhausting shift. The diner had been packed, and I was looking forward to getting home and collapsing into bed. As I entered the forest, I noticed how quiet it was. Usually, there'd be the sound of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But tonight, there was nothing, just an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to be out of the woods and back in the safety of my small apartment. That's when I saw it for the first time. A large, dark shape moving between the trees to my right. It was there and gone so quickly, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe a bear, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever I'd seen was much too large to be any normal forest animal. I picked up my pace, no longer walking, but not quite running yet. I didn't want to provoke whatever was out there into chasing me. The path ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly. The familiar landmarks I used to gauge my progress home, suddenly alien and indistinct in the darkness. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human, but something horrifyingly in between. That's when I started to run. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear it behind me, moving with impossible speed through the forest. Whatever it was gaining on me. As I ran, I realized with growing horror that I wasn't heading towards the edge of the forest and the safety of the town beyond. Somehow, impossibly, I was being herded deeper into the woods. Every time I tried to veer towards where I thought the town should be, I'd catch a glimpse of that massive, shadowy figure, cutting me off and forcing me to turn back into the depths of the forest. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead. I knew I couldn't keep running much longer. That's when I saw it, an old abandoned cabin looming out of the darkness ahead. Without thinking, I sprinted for it, praying the door wouldn't be locked. I slammed into the door, the rusty hinges groaning in protest as it swung open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me and fumbling with the ancient lock. As the bolt slid home, I heard a heavy thud outside, as if something large had landed on the cabin's porch. For a long moment, there was silence. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of claws dragging across the wooden door. "Open up, little runner," a voice growled from outside. It was deep, guttural, barely recognizable as speech. "You can't hide in there forever." I pressed my hands over my mouth to stifle a scream. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist. They were stories, legends, not something that chased you through the woods on your way home from work. The scratching continued, moving from the door to the boarded-up windows. I could hear wood splintering as whatever was out there tested the cabin's defenses. I looked around frantically, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. The cabin was bare, long since stripped of anything useful, but in the corner I spotted a trapdoor in the floor. Without thinking, I ran to it, yanking it open and lowering myself into the darkness below. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of damp earth and decay. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, using its weak light to survey my surroundings. The space was small, with earthen walls and a low ceiling, and there, on the far wall, was another door. Hope surged through me. Maybe this was a way out, a tunnel leading to safety. I moved towards it, my hand reaching for the handle. That's when I heard the voice again, this time from directly above me. "I can smell your fear, little runner." "It's intoxicating." There was a tremendous crash from upstairs, the sound of wood splintering and furniture being thrown aside. It had broken into the cabin. With shaking hands, I yanked open the cellar door. Beyond was a narrow tunnel, its earthen walls supported by old rotting timbers. I didn't know where it led, but anywhere was better than here. I plunged into the tunnel, using my phone's light to guide me. Behind me, I could hear the thing entering the cellar, its claws scrabbling on the earthen floor. I ran as I'd never run before, ignoring the roots that snagged at my clothes and the low ceiling that forced me to stoop. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until I had no idea which direction I was heading. My phone's battery was dying, the light growing dimmer with each passing second, and always, I could hear it behind me. Sometimes it sounded far away, other times terrifyingly close. Just as my phone's light finally gave out, plunging me into total darkness, my outstretched hands met empty air. The tunnel opened up into a larger space. I stumbled forward, tripping over something and falling hard onto a cold and stone floor. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter. Low, rumbling laughter that echoed off the stone walls around me. "Well done, little runner," that terrible voice said from the darkness. "You've made it to the end of the trail, but I'm afraid this is where your journey truly begins." A match flared to life, illuminating the space around me. I was in a large cavern, its walls covered in strange, primitive paintings. And there, standing between me and what looked like the cavern's exit, was the creature that had been chasing me. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. A nightmarish blend of wolf and human features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. What are you?" I managed to gasp out. The creature's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile, but on that inhuman face, it was a terrifying sight. "I've been called many things over the centuries: Dogman, Wendigo, Skinwalker, but names are unimportant. What matters is why you're here." It took a step towards me, its claws clicking on the stone floor. "You humans have forgotten the old ways, the ancient pacts between your kind and ours. You treat the forest as your playground, taking without giving back. Such imbalance cannot be allowed to continue." It reached out one massive hand, claws extended. "But don't worry. You're going to help restore the balance, whether you want to or not." In that moment, faced with this impossible creature and its incomprehensible demands, something inside me snapped. The terror that had driven me here gave way to a surge of desperate anger. "No," I said, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. "I don't know what you are or what you want, but you don't have the right to do this. I'm a person, not some sacrifice for your twisted idea of balance." The creature paused, its head tilting to one side in what might have been surprise. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then, to my utter astonishment, it threw back its head and laughed. The sound was like rocks grinding together, utterly inhuman, but undeniably amused. Well, it rumbled. "Perhaps there's more to you than I thought, little runner. It's been a long time since a human showed such spirit in the face of the unknown." It lowered its hand, taking a step back. "Very well, you've earned your freedom, but heed my words. The balance must be maintained. Learn the old ways, respect the forest and its denizens, or our next meeting will not end so pleasantly." With that, it melted back into the shadows, leaving me alone in the cavern. It took me hours to find my way out, emerging from a hidden entrance I'd never noticed before. Despite my familiarity with the woods, I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I moved away and never set foot in those woods again. But the truth is, I stayed. Something had awakened in me that night, a realization that the world was far stranger and more wondrous than I'd ever imagined. I spent the next months learning everything I could about the legends of the area, about the old ways of living in harmony with the forest. I left offerings at the edge of the woods, spoke words of gratitude for every mushroom I picked, every moment of peace I enjoyed under the canopy of trees. And sometimes, on dark nights when the moon is full, I catch a glimpse of a large, shadowy figure moving through the trees. But I'm not afraid anymore. I've learned to respect the ancient rules of the forest, and in doing so, I've found a deeper connection to the natural world than I ever thought possible. The creature was right about one thing. The balance must be maintained. And now, I'm a part of that balance. A guardian of the old ways, in a world that's forgotten the magic and mystery that still lurks in the dark corners of the wilderness. Story 11. The first howl echoed through the gorge, just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. It was long, deep, and so unnatural that it stopped me mid-sentence. My friend Mark, who was stoking the campfire, froze too. We both stared into the growing darkness, the flames casting flickering shadows around us. Neither of us said anything at first, but the silence between us was thick, heavy with unspoken fear. I'd never heard anything like that before. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a wolf either. I'd grown up in these parts, hiking and camping since I was a kid, and I knew the sounds of the wilderness. But that howl, it was something different, something wrong. Mark cleared his throat, trying to laugh it off. Probably just a wolf, he said, though the uncertainty in his voice didn't escape me. I didn't respond. We were miles from the nearest town, camping in a secluded part of the gorge that was rarely visited by anyone. It was exactly the kind of place we liked, quiet, far from civilization. But now, with the sun gone and that sound lingering in the air, the isolation didn't feel as appealing. I stared out into the darkness, the firelight barely reaching the edge of the trees. The shadows seemed to move, twisting with the wind, but I told myself it was just my imagination. We'd come out here to escape the noise of the world, to clear our heads, not to get spooked by some strange animal noise. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in my gut. Something felt off, but I wasn't about to admit that to Mark. He'd just called me paranoid. Instead, I grabbed another log and tossed it onto the fire, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. Mark started talking again, something about the stars or his job back in the city. But I wasn't really listening. My attention was still on the forest, on the thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to press in closer with each passing minute. Then it happened again. Another howl, this time closer, much closer. Mark stopped mid-sentence, his eyes snapping to mine. "That's not a wolf," he muttered. I nodded, my heart starting to race. The sound had come from just beyond the trees, maybe 100 yards away. And it wasn't just the distance that bothered me. It was the sheer power behind the howl, like it came from something big, too big. Mark stood up, grabbing the flashlight from his pack. "I'll check it out." "Are you insane?" I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. "You're not going out there." He paused, staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "What?" "You scared?" I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just don't think it's a good idea to go wandering off into the woods after hearing something like that. We don't know what's out there." He rolled his eyes, but there was a flicker of doubt in them. "It's probably just some animal, man. Don't get all paranoid on me." But I wasn't being paranoid, and deep down, I think Mark knew that. There was something in the air, something heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I could feel it pressing down on me, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Another howl ripped through the night, closer still. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the flashlight switch. This time, he didn't make any sarcastic remarks. The sound had unnerved him too. I stood up, moving closer to the fire. "We should stay here, by the fire," I said, my voice low. "Whatever it is, it's getting closer. I don't think we want to meet it." For a long moment, Mark didn't say anything. He just stared into the dark, the flashlight still clutched in his hand. Then, slowly, he nodded and sat back down, though he didn't look convinced. We sat in tense silence for what felt like hours, the fire crackling between us, the night swallowing everything beyond its light. Every time the wind rustled the leaves or a branch snapped in the distance, my heart would skip a beat. I kept expecting that howl again, expecting something to burst through the trees at any second, but it didn't come. The forest was dead silent now. "That's not normal," Mark whispered, breaking the quiet. "Where are the crickets? The frogs?" I hadn't even noticed, but he was right. The usual sounds of the night, the insects, the small animals scurrying through the underbrush, they were gone. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. "We need to get out of here," I said quietly, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. "Now!" Mark looked at me, his face pale in the firelight. "And go where?" "It's pitch black, and we're miles from the truck. We have flashlights. We can follow the trail back," I said, already reaching for my pack. My gut was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from whatever was out there as possible. But before I could finish packing up, there was a new sound. This one wasn't a howl. It was a low, deep growl, vibrating through the air, coming from the tree line. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the darkness, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. Mark stood up slowly, his flashlight pointed toward the trees. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my pulse thundering in my ears. The growl came again, closer this time, more menacing. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush, the snapping of twigs and the rustle of leaves. Mark shined the flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, all I could see were trees, shadows dancing in the light, and then I saw it. Two glowing eyes, reflecting back at us from the darkness, hovering just above the ground. They were too far apart to belong to any animal I knew of, too high up, and they were moving, slowly, deliberately, getting closer. "Get behind the fire," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Now!" Mark didn't argue this time. He moved quickly, positioning himself on the opposite side of the fire from the creature. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. What the hell was that thing? A bear? No, bears didn't have glowing eyes like that. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and the creature stepped closer just at the edge of the firelight now. I could make out its massive shape, its hunched form covered in thick fur. It walked on two legs, its arms hanging low, its hands, clawed hands, nearly dragging the ground. But its face was the stuff of nightmares. It was canine, but twisted, deformed. Its snout was long and filled with jagged yellow teeth that glinted in the firelight. Its ears were pointed, twitching as it listened to the sound of our breathing. And those eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, were fixed on us with a hunger that made my blood run cold. Mark cursed under his breath, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered back, my throat dry. "But we're not staying to find out." The creature let out a low snarl, its lips curling back to reveal more of those sharp teeth. It took another step closer, just outside the reach of the fire's glow. "We have to move now," I said, my voice shaking. "When I say go, we run. Don't stop, don't look back." Mark nodded, his face pale, fear etched into every line. We locked eyes for a brief moment, both of us understanding the stakes. Then died without warning. The creature lunged. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing Mark's arm and pulling him with me as we bolted toward the trail. The creature let out a deafening roar behind us, its footsteps heavy and fast, gaining on us as we sprinted through the darkness. Branches whipped against my face, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. I could hear it behind us, its growls getting louder, closer, the sound of its claws tearing through the underbrush. "Don't stop!" I yelled, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We ran for what felt like an eternity, the creature always just behind us, always just out of reach, but somehow we made it. The trail opened up ahead, the faint glow of the moon illuminating the path that led back to the truck. We didn't stop running until we reached it, throwing ourselves inside and slamming the door shut. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the keys, my heart pounding in my chest. The engine roared to life, and without a second thought, I floored it, speeding down the narrow trail, leaving the forest and whatever that thing was behind. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't have to. We both knew what we'd seen, and no amount of rationalizing was going to change that. There are things in the woods, things that shouldn't exist, things you can't explain. And now, We'd come face to face with one of them, and I'd never camp in those mountains again. Story 12. The moment I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me from the trail camera footage, I knew my life would never be the same. What I'd captured wasn't just an animal passing through the forest. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist outside of legends and campfire stories. And now, as I sit here in my darkened living room, ears straining for any sound from outside, I realize that by uncovering its secret, I may have made myself its next target. My name is Daniel, and until a week ago, I was just an amateur wildlife photographer with a passion for capturing the hidden lives of the animals in the forests near my home. I'd set up trail cameras in various locations, hoping to get some interesting shots of deer, bears, or maybe even the elusive mountain lions that were rumored to roam these parts. What I got instead was a one-way ticket into a nightmare. It all started last Friday when I went to collect the memory cards from my cameras. It was a routine I'd done dozens of times before, hiking out to each location, swapping out the cards, and then spending the evening reviewing the footage. Usually, it was hours of nothing interspersed with the occasional deer or raccoon, but this time was different. I remember sitting at my computer, a cup of coffee cooling beside me as I clicked through the images. The first few cameras showed the usual, some deer, a few foxes, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I got to the footage from the camera I'd placed deep in the old-growth section of the forest. The first image made me sit up straighter. It showed a large, dark shape moving through the frame. At first I thought it might be a bear, but something about the proportions was off. It was too tall, too lean. I clicked to the next image, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The creature was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, shaggy fur, but its body shape was all wrong for a bear. It stood upright on 2 legs, its arms hanging down past its knees, ending in hands tipped with what looked like razor-sharp claws. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. It was a nightmarish blend of canine and human features, with a pronounced snout and pointed ears, but eyes that were undeniably intelligent and aware. I must have sat there for an hour, clicking back and forth between the images, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had to be a hoax, right? Someone in a costume playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The way it moved, the details of its fur and claws, this was no costume. As night fell, I found myself unable to look away from the screen. I pored over every image, trying to glean any information I could about this impossible creature. And that's when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. In the final image of the sequence, the creature was looking directly at the camera. No, not just looking. It was smiling. A terrible, knowing smile that seemed to say, "I see you watching me, and now I'm coming for you." I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. What was this thing? How long had it been out there? And most importantly, did it know I had seen it? The next morning I convinced myself I was overreacting. In the harsh light of day, it was easier to believe that there must be some rational explanation. Maybe it was an undiscovered species, some kind of primitive human relative that had somehow survived in these remote woods. I decided to go back out to the camera location to see if I could find any physical evidence of the creature's passage. Looking back now, I realize how foolish that decision was, but at the time, my curiosity overrode my fear. I packed a bag with some supplies, grabbed my camera, and headed out into the forest. The hike to the camera location took about 2 hours. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me whipping my head around, searching for the source. But I saw nothing out of the ordinary. When I reached the camera, my heart sank. The device had been torn from the tree it was strapped to, its casing cracked open like an egg. The memory card was missing. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Whatever this creature was, it was intelligent enough to understand what the camera was and to want to destroy the evidence of its existence. That's when I heard it. a low, rumbling growl coming from the dense underbrush behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees, stood the creature from the photos. Seeing it in person, I realized the camera hadn't done it justice. It was even larger than I'd thought, its presence radiating a palpable aura of power and menace. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could hear my own ragged breathing, see the plumes of vapor in the cool forest air. The creature's chest rose and fell slowly, calmly. It seemed to be assessing me, deciding what to do. Then, in a move that defied everything I thought I knew about animal behavior, it spoke. The voice was deep, guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but the words were unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come back, little photographer." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist. They were stories, legends, not something you encountered on a routine hike in the woods. The creature took a step forward, emerging fully from the shadows. In the daylight, I could see every terrifying detail. The muscles rippling beneath its fur, the yellowed fangs protruding from its jaw, the intelligence gleaming in its eerily human-like eyes. What are you?" I managed to gasp out. The creature's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile, but on that inhuman face, it was a terrifying sight. I've been called many things over the centuries: Dogman, Wendigo, Skinwalker, but names are unimportant. What matters is that you've seen something you were never meant to see. It took another step towards me, its claws clicking against the rocks on the forest floor. Humans have forgotten the old ways, the ancient pacts between your kind and ours. You treat the forest as your playground, thinking you can observe and document without consequence. But some secrets are meant to stay hidden. I backed away, my hand fumbling in my pocket for my phone. But before I could grab it, the creature moved with impossible speed. Suddenly it was right in front of me, its massive hand closing around my wrist. "No calls for help, little photographer. This is between you and me." Its grip was like iron, and I could feel the prick of its claws against my skin. I was certain that in that moment my life was over. But then, to my utter astonishment, it released me. "I could kill you," it growled. "It would be easy, but perhaps there's another way, a way to restore the balance." It fixed me with those intelligent eyes, and I felt as if it were looking straight into my soul. "You have a choice to make, little photographer. You can leave this forest and never return. Destroy those images you captured, forget what you've seen here. Or you can stay, learn the old ways, become a guardian of the secrets these woods hold. But know this, if you choose to stay, your old life is over. You'll be part of something ancient and terrible, a world hidden from the eyes of ordinary humans." I stood there, trembling, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this impossible creature as I could. But another part, a part I didn't fully understand, was intrigued, terrified, yes, but also filled with a burning curiosity to know more. I need time to think," I stammered. The creature nodded, a surprisingly human gesture on its inhuman face. "You have until the next full moon. Return here with your decision. But remember, choose wisely. For once you step into our world, there's no stepping back." With that, it turned and loped off into the forest, moving with a grace that belied its massive size. I stood there for a long time, my legs shaking, trying to come to terms with what had just happened. That was 5 days ago. Since then, I've barely slept, barely eaten. I've pored over every book, every website I could find about folklore and cryptids, searching for any information that might help me understand what I've stumbled into. And all the while, I've wrestled with the choice before me. Do I walk away, try to forget what I've seen, go back to my normal life, pretending that the world is the simple, rational place I always believed it to be? Or do I take the plunge into a hidden world of ancient secrets and terrible wonders? The full moon is tomorrow night. In a few hours, I'll hike back out to that spot in the forest and give the creature my answer. I still don't know what I'm going to say, but as I sit here in the darkness, listening to the wind in the trees outside my window, I can't shake the feeling that no matter what I choose, my life will never be the same again. The veil has been lifted, and I've glimpsed a world beyond anything I could have imagined, a world of mystery, danger, and ancient magic. And deep down, I know that once you've seen behind that veil, there's no going back. The only question is, am I brave enough or foolish enough to step through? Story 13. There are places in the wilderness that people don't go, places that feel forgotten, abandoned even by time itself. I've spent years hiking and exploring every hidden corner of the mountains, chasing that thrill of discovery, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found that day, or for what found me. It started like any other hike, a quiet day in the mountains with the air crisp and clean, the sun casting long shadows through the dense canopy of trees. I had taken an unmarked trail I'd stumbled upon a few months back, tucked away behind a rock slide and overgrown with moss. I figured it was an old hunting path or maybe an old logging trail that had fallen into disuse. Something about it called to me, like it was a secret just waiting to be uncovered. The first few hours were uneventful, just the sounds of the forest around me, birds chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals scurried through the underbrush. But the deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The birds stopped singing. The wind didn't seem to reach this part of the trail. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, watching. That's when I saw the cave. It wasn't on any map, and I'd been through these mountains enough times to know that I should have seen it before. But there it was, tucked away behind a tangle of vines and thick brush, almost completely hidden from view. The opening was massive, easily large enough for a truck to drive through, but it was the darkness inside that made me pause. Even in the bright midday light, the mouth of the cave seemed to swallow the light whole, leaving only a gaping black hole. I should have turned back then. Every instinct I had told me to leave it alone, to forget I'd ever seen it. But curiosity has a way of making you do stupid things, so I pressed forward, pushing through the brush until I stood at the entrance. The air was cooler here, the temperature dropping sharply the closer I got to the cave. I flicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The walls were rough, jagged rock, and the ground sloped downward, leading me deeper into the mountain. My footsteps echoed in the narrow space, the sound bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the inky blackness ahead. The deeper I went, the more the air changed, musty, damp, like the inside of an old tomb. And then, as I rounded a corner, I saw them. Nests, not small, delicate bird nests. These were huge, made of twisted branches and strips of bark, each one large enough to fit a grown man. They were clustered together along the far wall of the cave, set back in the shadows, and there were things inside them. Tufts of fur, bones, small ones, likely from animals. But the way they were arranged sent a chill down my spine. The nests felt wrong, too deliberate, like something intelligent had made them. I should have left right then, turned around and run as fast as I could back to the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was close to discovering something important, something no one had ever seen before. I took another step closer to the nests, shining my flashlight over them, and that's when I saw the carvings. On the walls, just above the nests, were strange symbols etched into the rock. They looked ancient, worn smooth in some places by time, but they were still visible, jagged, geometric shapes that twisted and looped in ways that hurt my eyes if I stared at them too long. I didn't recognize the symbols, and I doubted anyone else would either. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about this place was ancient, far older than the trail I had been following, and far older than I was prepared for. I turned to leave, my heart hammering in my chest, but as I did, something blocked the entrance. At first, I thought it was a shadow, just the shifting of the light as my flashlight swung back toward the cave's mouth, but the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure. It stood just inside the cave, hunched over but still towering above me, its broad shoulders filling the entrance. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain tried to convince me it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree or a boulder that had fallen near the entrance, but then it moved. A low, rumbling growl filled the cave, reverberating off the walls and settling deep in my chest. The thing, whatever it was, took a step forward, and I caught a glimpse of it in the beam of my flashlight. It was massive, easily over 8 feet tall, with thick, matted fur covering its body. Its arms were long, almost dragging the ground, and its hands, if you could call them that, ended in long, twisted claws. But it was the face that froze me in place. It wasn't human, not even close. The eyes were sunken, glowing faintly in the dim light, and its mouth was wide, filled with sharp, jagged teeth that protruded from its upper jaw. It stared at me, unblinking, its chest rising and falling with each deep breath. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. This thing, this creature, wasn't supposed to exist. It couldn't exist, but it did, and it was watching me. The creature took another step forward, and the low growl became a snarl, sharp and guttural, like it was warning me not to move. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline flooding my veins, but I still couldn't move. All I could do was stare back at it, my mind racing with thoughts of what it would do next. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. I reacted instinctively, diving to the side just as the creature swiped at me with its massive claws. The air whooshed past my face as I hit the ground hard, pain shooting up my arm from the impact. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging as I bolted for the narrow passage that led deeper into the cave. It was a stupid move, I know, but the creature was blocking the entrance, and my only thought was to put distance between us. I sprinted through the twisting cave, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the sound of the creature's footsteps echoed behind me, heavy and deliberate. It was following me, stalking me through its lair, and I knew there was no way out. I reached the end of the cave, where the walls closed in on all sides, and I realized too late that I was trapped. The creature's growl filled the space behind me, and I turned slowly, my back pressed against the cold stone as I raised my flashlight. The creature stood at the entrance to the chamber, its glowing eyes locked on mine. It didn't move at first, just watched me with a terrifying intensity, as if it was deciding what to do next. My hands trembled, the flashlight shaking in my grip as I tried to steady my breath, tried to think of some way to get out of this. And then, without warning, it roared. The sound was deafening, filling the small chamber and rattling the stones beneath my feet. I dropped to the ground, covering my ears as the creature charged toward me. I braced myself, knowing this was it, that I had nowhere left to run, but just as the creature was upon me, something strange happened. It stopped. It skidded to a halt just a few feet away, its massive form looming over me, its breath hot and rancid as it stared down at me. I looked up, confused, trying to make sense of why it hadn't finished me off. Then I saw it. The symbols on the walls, those strange, ancient carvings, they were glowing now, faint but unmistakable. The creature's eyes darted to the glowing symbols, and it let out a low, guttural snarl before backing away, its gaze never leaving the carvings. I didn't understand what was happening, but I wasn't about to question it. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking as I bolted past the creature and out of the chamber. It didn't follow. It just stood there watching me with those glowing eyes, its chest heaving as it let out another low growl. I didn't stop running until I was out of the cave, out of the forest, and back on the main trail. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that place as possible. I never told anyone what I saw that day. No one would believe me if I did, but I know the truth. There are things in the wilderness, ancient things, that don't belong in our world, and I found one of them. I won't go back. Story 14. The first time I saw the stones, I thought they were just a strange formation, nothing more than a natural oddity in the middle of the forest. I'd been patrolling this section of the park for years, and not once had I come across anything like it. But there they were, set in a perfect circle, ancient-looking and covered in moss. There was something about them, something that made my skin crawl, but I didn't know why at the time. I should have turned back, should have taken it as a sign to leave. But I didn't. I stayed, and that was my first mistake. I was out on my usual patrol, covering a remote part of the park that rarely saw visitors. The trail had been washed out after a heavy rainstorm, so I decided to hike a bit off the beaten path. It was late afternoon, and the sun was filtering through the trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I'd gone further than I intended when I found the stones. At first, they looked like just another pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I realized they were arranged deliberately. 12 stones, each one the size of a small boulder, standing upright in a perfect circle about 20 feet across. In the center, the ground was bare, no leaves, no grass, just smooth dirt like it had been cleared recently. I stopped in my tracks, a strange feeling settling over me. It wasn't fear exactly, but an overwhelming sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. The air felt heavier around the stones, and the forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, had gone completely silent. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the dried leaves as I circled the perimeter. The stones were old, covered in moss and lichen, and each one had deep grooves etched into its surface, symbols I didn't recognize. They were worn, barely visible under the layers of time, but they had been carved with purpose. I crouched down to get a better look, running my fingers over the strange markings. The grooves were cold to the touch, colder than they should have been for a warm afternoon. I frowned, pulling my hand back and standing up. Something about the whole scene felt off, like I had wandered into a place that had been forgotten, or worse, deliberately hidden. As I stood there, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, I heard it, a whisper, soft at first, like the wind moving through the trees. But there was no wind. The air was still, suffocating. The whisper came again, clearer this time. A word, or maybe a name. I couldn't make it out, but it seemed to come from all around me, like the forest itself was speaking. My heart started to race, my pulse loud in my ears as I looked around. There was no one there, no movement in the trees, no sign of life at all. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the sudden quiet. Nothing. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the trees, half expecting someone to step out from behind the stones, some prankster trying to scare the new ranger. But there was no one, just the stones and the thick, oppressive silence. That's when I noticed the bones. Scattered near the edge of the circle, half buried in the dirt, were small animal bones, rabbits, squirrels, maybe even birds. At first glance, they looked like the remains of predators, nature taking its course. But as I knelt down for a closer look, I realized they weren't just scattered randomly. They were arranged, placed carefully in patterns around the stones. A chill ran down my spine, and I stood up quickly, brushing the dirt from my hands. I suddenly felt like I was being watched. The forest around me seemed darker, the shadows longer, and that feeling of being somewhere I didn't belong was gnawing at the back of my mind. I decided it was time to go. I'd seen enough strange things as a ranger to know when to trust my instincts, and everything in me was screaming to get out of there. As I turned to leave, the whisper came again, louder this time. My name. I froze, my blood turning to ice. There was no mistaking it. The voice had said my name, clear as day, and it wasn't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. It was everywhere, surrounding me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the stones were just as still and silent as before. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. Again, silence. I started walking quickly, my boots crunching over the leaves as I headed back the way I came. but the deeper I moved into the forest, the more lost I felt. The trail had vanished, replaced by thick underbrush and trees that looked identical in every direction. The stones were far behind me now, but I could still feel their presence, like they were pulling me back toward them. My radio crackled to life on my hip, startling me. I grabbed it, relief flooding through me as I heard the static. "Base, this is Ranger Adams. Do you copy?" Nothing. I tried again. "Base, come in. I think I'm lost out here." More static, followed by a low, distorted voice that I couldn't make out. It wasn't anyone from the station. It sounded wrong, like it wasn't meant for me. My hands started to shake as I tried to adjust the frequency, but no matter what I did, all I got was more static and that strange, broken voice whispering words I couldn't understand. I shoved the radio back onto my belt and started walking faster. The trees seemed to be closing in, the branches overhead blocking out what little sunlight was left. My head was spinning, my heart racing as I tried to find the trail, tried to remember which direction I had come from, but everything looked the same, and the more I moved, the more disoriented I became. The whisper came again, louder now, more insistent. My name, repeated over and over, echoing through the trees. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes. I didn't care which direction I was going anymore. I just needed to get out, to escape whatever was calling to me. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast, the voice followed. It was closer now, almost inside my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing me, something I couldn't see but could feel. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I risked a glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't a person, it was something else, something tall and thin, its limbs too long, its body too twisted to be human. It was following me, keeping pace, always just out of sight but close enough that I could feel its eyes on me. I ran harder, pushing my body to the limit, the muscles in my legs screaming with every step. The forest blurred around me, and I didn't care anymore. I had to get away, had to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever was stalking me. But the voice was inside my head now, louder than ever, drowning out everything else. "Come back." I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I went down hard, hitting the ground with a thud that knocked the wind out of me. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to get up, but my leg gave out beneath me. I was trapped. I looked up, my vision swimming, and there it was, the shadow. It stood at the edge of the trees, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the growing darkness. I reached for my radio, but it was gone, lost somewhere in the forest. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding as the shadow moved closer, its twisted form shifting unnaturally as it approached. And then, just as it reached me, everything went black. I woke up the next morning, lying on the forest floor, the sunlight filtering through the trees. My ankle throbbed, but I was alive. The stones were gone, the shadow was gone, but the whisper is still with me, and it's getting louder. Story 15. The forest always felt different at night, alive with things that shouldn't be seen. I knew this park like the back of my hand, had walked every inch of its trails in daylight and moonlight alike. But tonight, it was different. There was a stillness in the air, a kind of heaviness that weighed on my chest. As a ranger, I'd learned to listen to the forest's cues, to sense when something was off. And tonight, every hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. The call had come in just after sundown. "Got a report of an injured animal out near the Old Pine Trail," dispatch said over the radio. "Sounds pretty bad. You're the closest, so can you check it out?" I didn't think much of it at first. Injured animals were part of the job. Usually, it was a deer tangled in some brush or a coyote that had a run-in with a trap. Grabbing my flashlight and radio, I set out into the darkness, the chill of the evening settling into my bones. The moon was full, casting eerie, elongated shadows on the ground, every tree looking like a twisted claw reaching out to snatch me. I pushed the feeling down. I was a professional. About half a mile down the old pine trail, I found the blood. It was fresh, bright against the dark soil and fallen leaves. A heavy trail of it led off the path, seeping into the undergrowth. I knelt to get a closer look, holding my flashlight steady. Whatever had bled here was large and badly hurt. As I examined the scene, a shiver crawled up my spine. Something didn't add up. The tracks surrounding the blood were deep, clawed, but they weren't animal tracks that I recognized. They were large, too large, and they had an unnatural gait, as if the creature was walking on two legs. I stood up, my senses on high alert, ears straining to catch any sound in the forest around me. I could hear my own breathing, the rustle of leaves in the slight breeze, and then silence, a silence so complete that it made my ears ring. The forest had gone quiet. Not even the usual hum of insects filled the air. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. I swept my flashlight across the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. Shadows danced and leaped as I moved, but nothing stood out. And then I heard it. A faint, deep, almost guttural breathing. It was slow, deliberate, and it was close. "Hello?" I called out, more out of habit than hope. "Anyone out there?" Nothing. The breathing stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy shuffling through the leaves behind me. I whipped around, pointing the light in the direction of the noise, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam caught a flash of movement, something slipping behind a tree just outside the range of my light. It was big, tall and broad, but it moved with an unsettling speed and silence. A lump formed in my throat. "This isn't right," I muttered to myself. I wanted to turn back, head for the safety of the main trail, but my legs felt frozen in place. I had to know what was out there. My hand went to the radio on my belt. "Dispatch, I'm on Old Pine, about half a mile in. Found a blood trail, seems like something large." I paused, glancing around, eyes scanning the darkness. "Might need backup." A crackle of static came through, followed by, "Copy that, sending another unit your way. ETA 10 minutes. 10 minutes. It felt like an eternity out here in the dark. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and forced myself to move, to follow the blood trail deeper into the trees. The smell hit me first. It was a pungent, coppery scent, mixed with something else, something musky, wild and rotting. I fought the urge to gag as I continued forward, my flashlight beam catching glimpses of matted fur on the ground, broken branches, and more blood. Whatever had been injured had dragged itself into the undergrowth, but what worried me more was what might be following it. Another snap of a branch echoed behind me, closer this time. I spun around, flashlight darting through the trees. There, just at the edge of the beam, I saw it, a shape standing upright. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall, towering over the underbrush, its body cloaked in dark fur. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing a haunting amber in the darkness. Dogman. The stories I'd heard from locals and campers flooded back into my mind. They spoke of a creature half man, half wolf, that stalked these woods. I'd always dismissed them as folklore, campfire tales meant to scare people, but now here it was, real, solid, and staring directly at me. I took a shaky step back, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The creature watched me, its head tilted slightly as if assessing me, deciding what to do next. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. A low growl rumbled up from its chest, vibrating through the air. "Back off," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it louder would provoke it. I kept the flashlight trained on its face, hoping the light would keep it at bay. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward, its claws crunching on the leaves and twigs beneath its feet. I took another step back, nearly tripping over a root, my mind racing. My hand fumbled for the radio again. "Dispatch, I need help. There's something out here with me. I need backup now." Silence on the other end. Just static. I cursed under my breath, keeping my eyes locked on the beast. It moved closer, its breath coming out in slow, visible puffs in the cold night air. The moonlight cast its shadow on the ground, stretching out towards me like a dark, reaching hand. I turned and ran. Branches whipped against my face as I barreled through the trees, flashlight beam bobbing wildly with each stride. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the undergrowth, moving impossibly fast for something so large. My lungs burned, each breath ragged and sharp in the cold air. I didn't dare look back. The trail loomed ahead, a narrow path that might lead me back to the ranger station. I veered towards it, my legs pumping harder than they ever had before. I could feel it gaining on me, the ground trembling slightly under its weight with each thundering step. Just a few more feet. A heavy impact struck me from behind, knocking me to the ground. I hit the dirt hard, the flashlight flying from my grip, its beam spinning wildly before coming to rest, casting an eerie light on the forest floor. I scrambled, trying to push myself up, but the creature was there, its massive hand or paw pressing down on my back. I gasped, feeling its claws dig into my jacket, pinning me in place. My head swam, fear flooding every inch of my body. I twisted my neck to look up. And there it was, standing over me, its eyes glowing in the beam of the fallen flashlight. It snarled, saliva dripping from its maw, and I felt the heat of its breath on my face. This was it. But then, a distant shout pierced the air, followed by the blinding flash of a spotlight cutting through the darkness. "Ranger, over here!" The creature hesitated, its gaze flicking to the light and back to me. In that brief second, it released its hold, stepping back into the shadows. I watched, dazed and shaking, as it melted into the forest, its form vanishing among the trees, leaving only the echoes of its growl behind. I struggled to my feet as my fellow rangers burst through the brush, their flashlights sweeping the area. "What the hell was that?" one of them panted, eyes wide as he scanned the darkness. I shook my head, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." They guided me back to the trail, their voices buzzing with questions, but I could hardly process what had just happened. All I knew was that the stories were true. There was something in these woods, something that didn't belong to the natural order of things. As we made our way back to the ranger station, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, peering into the darkness. The forest was silent again, as if nothing had ever happened, but I knew better. Somewhere out there, it was still watching, waiting, and next time, I might not be so lucky. Story 16. I knew I shouldn't have ventured out alone. That's the rule of the woods. Never hike alone, especially not in the early morning fog. But something about the heavy mist, swirling lazily through the towering pines, called to me. It was supposed to be a quick morning hike, a solitary escape before the world woke up. Little did I know, I wasn't alone out here. The fog had rolled in thick that morning, wrapping around the trees and hugging the forest floor. My boots crunched against the damp leaves and twigs as I made my way along the trail, my breath visible in the cold air. Everything felt muffled, the world reduced to the few feet ahead of me that the fog allowed me to see. Despite the eerie stillness, I felt a strange pull to keep going, to explore the forest shrouded in its ghostly veil. I told myself it was just the thrill of the unknown, the allure of solitude. There's something mesmerizing about being enveloped by fog, as if you've crossed into another realm where the forest itself could come alive. The deeper I ventured, the quieter everything seemed to become. Even the birds had stopped singing. It was just me, the path, and the dense, all-consuming fog. After about an hour, I decided it was time to turn back. The sun would be up soon, burning away the mist, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. I reached for my water bottle, but as I took a swig, I heard it, a faint, guttural noise that reverberated through the fog. I froze, water bottle halfway to my lips. It sounded almost like a deep sigh, a rumbling exhalation from something large. I strained my ears, trying to locate the direction it came from, but the fog distorted everything, bouncing sound off unseen surfaces and giving it an unsettling, hollow quality. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, though I couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling settling in my gut. I took a deep breath and continued along the trail, picking up the pace, my footsteps crunching louder in the silent woods. But the noise came again, closer this time, a low, throaty growl that didn't belong to any deer I knew of. My heart began to pound, each thud echoing in my ears. I stopped, scanning my surroundings. The fog pressed in, limiting my vision to a mere 10 feet in every direction. I turned slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was making that sound, but there was nothing. Just swirling grey mist and shadowy outlines of trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and hollow in the thick air. The forest swallowed my words, leaving me in silence. Then a soft rustling to my right. My head snapped in that direction, eyes straining to pierce the fog. A shape moved, large and dark, but it was gone before I could focus on it. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. This wasn't right. I'd encountered plenty of animals in the forest before, deer, coyotes, even bears, but this felt different. There was an intelligence in the way it moved, the way it stayed just outside my line of sight, hidden in the fog. I started to walk again, this time faster, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, fogging up the cold air. The path wound through the trees, but the fog made it hard to see where I was going. I stumbled over a root, catching myself on a nearby tree, and that's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping. I turned, eyes wide, flashlight trembling in my grasp. The sound was coming from deeper in the woods, a steady beat like someone knocking on wood. It echoed through the fog, a deliberate, almost ritualistic noise. I shined my light towards it, but the beam was swallowed by the fog, revealing nothing but empty air. "Who's there?" I yelled, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Silence. Then the knocking stopped, replaced by the creaking of branches as something moved in the distance. I stood there, frozen, the fog curling around me like icy fingers. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. And then I saw it. The fog parted for just a heartbeat, revealing a shape standing amidst the trees. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, covered in what looked like thick, matted hair. My breath hitched. It was upright, like a man, but it was anything but human. I could see the outline of broad shoulders, long arms hanging almost to its knees, and those eyes, they glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light from my flashlight like 2 burning embers. I blinked, and the fog closed in again, swallowing the figure whole. My heart raced, my mind reeling. I had heard stories, of course, rumors about Sasquatch sightings in these parts, but I had always brushed them off as legends, nothing more than folklore. Now standing there in the mist with my pulse pounding in my ears, I wasn't so sure. The forest grew deathly silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes every creak and rustle feel amplified. I took a shaky step back, eyes darting around, searching for another glimpse of the creature. The knocking sound resumed, this time from my left, followed by another from behind me. My chest tightened, fear coiling around my throat. There wasn't just one, they were communicating. I turned on my heel and started to run, the fog blurring the world into a dizzying swirl of grey. My lungs burned as I sprinted, feet pounding against the trail, the rhythmic knocking echoing in my ears like a drumbeat. The path seemed to stretch on forever, every tree looking the same in the dense fog. But I kept running, hoping, praying that I was heading back the way I came. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement again, a flash of fur and muscle, keeping pace with me. It moved impossibly fast for something so large, gliding between the trees like a shadow. Panic surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my legs. The trail finally opened up into a small clearing, and I stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. I glanced around, eyes wide, as the fog began to thin slightly in the open space. My heart thundered in my chest, and for a moment I thought I had lost them. But then, from the edge of the clearing, it appeared, The creature stepped forward, its massive form half hidden by the fog. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I raised it, the beam catching the outline of its hulking figure. It was closer now, close enough that I could see its fur, matted and wet, clinging to its broad chest. Its eyes glinted in the light, piercing and intelligent, watching me with an unnerving calmness. It took a step towards me, the ground seeming to shudder under its weight. I backed away, feeling the cold grip of fear tightening around my throat. I could barely breathe, barely think. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen in place, my legs refusing to obey. The creature paused, head tilting slightly as if studying me. For a brief, terrifying moment, I locked eyes with it. There was something ancient in its gaze, something that spoke of a deep, primal power. It opened its mouth, letting out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the air, a warning that echoed in my bones. I didn't need to be told twice. Finally breaking free of my paralysis, I turned and bolted, diving back into the trees. I could hear it behind me, a steady, thunderous rhythm as it moved through the forest, but I didn't look back. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance between us as possible. The fog was lifting as I ran, the pale light of dawn beginning to filter through the canopy. The trail became more defined, familiar landmarks coming into view. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming in protest, until I burst out onto the main trailhead, collapsing onto the gravel in a heap. For a few moments, I just lay there, chest heaving, eyes staring up at the treetops. The forest was silent again, the fog dissipating with the rising sun. Slowly, I sat up, glancing back the way I had come. The trail stretched out behind me, empty and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I saw. It was real. The fog had hidden something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. And as I made my way back to my car, legs trembling beneath me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting for the next time the fog would roll in and swallow the forest whole. Story 17. The wind whispered through the trees like a warning, carrying with it a chill that settled deep in my bones. I should have known better than to venture this far off the beaten path, but curiosity had gotten the better of me. Hiking was supposed to be an escape, a way to clear my head after a long week. Yet here I was, standing at the edge of an abandoned campsite, my stomach churning with unease. Something about this place felt wrong, very wrong. The campsite looked like it had been ransacked. Shredded tents flapped in the icy breeze, clothes and supplies strewn haphazardly across the clearing. I walked slowly, scanning the area with my flashlight, trying to piece together what could have happened. My boots crunched on the frozen ground, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the silence of the forest. There was a metallic tang in the air, the faint smell of blood and decay. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly despite my best effort to sound calm. "Anyone out here?" Silence. I moved closer to one of the torn tents, crouching down to inspect it. The fabric was shredded in long, deep gashes, like something had clawed its way in. My heart pounded in my chest. It didn't look like the work of a bear or a mountain lion. No, these marks were too precise, too deliberate, as if made by something that wanted to get inside. A rustle in the underbrush made me jerk upright, flashlight whipping towards the sound. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the darkness. The beam illuminated only more trees and a tangled mess of brambles, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. I waited, every muscle tense, ears straining to catch any further noise. But there was nothing, just the faint howl of the wind. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Something was wrong here. This wasn't just an animal attack. It felt off, like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching me with unseen eyes. I turned back to the campsite, forcing myself to focus. I needed to find some sign of the campers, any clue as to what had happened. A quick scan revealed a backpack lying half-buried under a pile of leaves. I knelt down, brushing the debris away, and unzipped it. Inside there was a flashlight, some scattered food wrappers, a wallet, I flipped open the wallet to find an ID card staring back at me. A man's face, smiling and oblivious to whatever horror had unfolded here. A sudden noise made me drop the wallet, my heart skipping a beat. It was faint, barely a whisper on the wind, but unmistakable. A voice. A low, garbled murmur, almost too distorted to be human. I froze, head snapping up to look around. The voice seemed to come from the trees, somewhere deep within the shadows. "Help! Me!" It was weak, hoarse, like someone barely clinging to life. My blood turned to ice. "Hello?" I called out, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Where are you?" The voice went silent. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for a response. Then it came again, faint but distinct. "Over here, please." It sounded off, like someone trying to mimic a voice but getting the tone all wrong. Still, I couldn't ignore a potential call for help. I grabbed my backpack and headed towards the sound, each step taking me further from the relative safety of the clearing and deeper into the dense forest. The air grew colder as I moved forward, the trees pressing in around me. Branches scraped against my arms, snagging on my clothes as if trying to hold me back. The ground became uneven, rocks jutting up through the frozen earth, threatening to twist my ankle with each step. My flashlight's beam bobbed erratically, casting long, shifting shadows that danced along the forest floor. The voice came again, closer this time. "Help! Please!" It sounded clearer, more distinct, but still carried that unnatural tone that set my nerves on edge. "Where are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and urgency. There was a pause, then a faint rustling ahead. I pushed through a cluster of bushes, the branches scratching my face as I stumbled into a small clearing. My heart sank as I saw it. A figure hunched over near the base of a tree, its back to me. It was gaunt, skeletal even, with limbs that seemed too long and thin. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and mottled in the flashlight's harsh glare. "Hey!" I called out, my voice wavering. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move at first. Then, with a slow, jerking motion, it turned its head to the side, just enough for me to see the edge of its face. My stomach lurched. Its eyes were hollow, sunken into dark sockets, and its mouth hung open in a wide, twisted grin. It spoke again, the voice slithering out in a grotesque mockery of human speech. "Help! Me!" I staggered back, my mind reeling. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. It was using a human voice, mimicking the words like a cruel imitation. My flashlight flickered, the light sputtering for a moment before holding steady, casting eerie shadows across its gaunt form. Then it moved. With an unnatural speed, it rose to its feet, limbs creaking and popping as they extended. It stood impossibly tall, towering over me, its grin stretching wider. My blood ran cold as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root in my haste. The creature took a step towards me, its eyes fixed on mine, empty and hungry. "No!" I gasped, scrambling backward. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of my ragged breathing filling my ears. The forest around me seemed to twist and shift, trees looming closer as if trying to trap me within their grasp. I could hear it behind me, the soft padding of its feet on the ground, the occasional snap of a branch as it pursued me. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I forced myself to keep going. I had to get away. Then the whispering started. It came from all around, low and murmuring, voices overlapping in a chilling cacophony. They called my name, twisted it, stretched it out into a mocking chant that set my teeth on edge. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the whispers only grew louder, drowning out everything else. I burst back into the original clearing, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around frantically, searching for some escape, some way out of this nightmare. But the forest was closing in, the trees dark and foreboding, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to ensnare me. The figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate gait. It moved silently, gliding across the ground as if floating. I backed away, my legs shaking, unable to tear my eyes away from its twisted, skeletal form. It stopped a few feet away, tilting its head to the side. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Then, in a voice that was a sickening blend of whispers and growls, it spoke. "Hungry!" I stumbled back, horror gripping me like a vice. My hand went to my backpack, fumbling for anything to defend myself. My fingers closed around a small flare, and without thinking, I yanked it out and struck it against the metal cap. It hissed and sparked to life, casting a bright red glow that cut through the darkness. The creature recoiled, its eyes narrowing as it hissed, a sound that vibrated through the air and sent a shiver down my spine. It backed away, retreating into the shadows at the edge of the clearing, its form blending into the darkness until it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Clutching the flare, I bolted for the trail, feet pounding against the ground, heart racing with every step. The whispers followed me, faint and mocking, but I kept running, my focus on the path ahead, on the faint glimmer of safety in the distance. I didn't stop until I was back at the main trailhead, collapsing to my knees as the flare burned out in my hand. The forest around me was silent, the whispers fading into the cold morning air. I stared back into the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps, knowing that whatever I'd encountered was still out there, lurking in the darkness. And it was waiting. Story 18. There was something off about this place. I felt it the moment we pulled up to the cabin. The air was too still, the woods too quiet, and a prickling sensation crept up my spine as we unloaded our gear. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, just 4 friends getting away from the city for some fresh air and a break from our phones. But as the shadows grew longer and the forest around us darkened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "Come on, Mark, give me a hand with this cooler," Sam called, snapping me out of my thoughts. I shook off the uneasy feeling, forcing a smile, and joined him in hauling our supplies inside. The cabin was small but cozy, a single-story structure with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a modest living room that opened into a kitchen. The woods pressed in close on all sides, visible through the windows, their dark, looming presence casting long shadows on the walls as the sun dipped below the horizon. We spent the first couple of hours unpacking and settling in. Sarah and Jenny had already claimed the main bedroom, leaving Sam and me to share the pull-out couch in the living room. It was all laughter and banter at first, the kind of fun you only get when you've known people for years. But as night fell, the mood shifted. The laughter grew quieter, conversations shorter, until eventually silence settled over the cabin like a thick blanket. "All right, guys, I'm going to start a fire outside," Sam announced, breaking the tension. "You coming, Mark?" "Yeah, sure," I replied, more eager to get out of the cabin than I'd admit. I grabbed my flashlight and followed him out to the fire pit just a few yards from the front porch. The night air was crisp, filled with the smell of pine and earth. I could see our breath misting in front of us as we worked, gathering kindling and stacking logs. It was then I noticed it, the scratching sound. At first, I thought it was just the rustling of branches in the wind, but there was no wind. The air was completely still, and yet I could hear a faint, deliberate scratching noise coming from the woods. I paused, straining my ears to pinpoint the sound, but it faded into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. Sam looked up from the fire he was building, eyebrows furrowed. "Hear what?" "Scratching, like something moving out there," I said, gesturing toward the trees. He listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably just an animal. We're in the middle of the forest, man. Relax." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease, but it lingered. We finished building the fire, its warm glow casting flickering shadows around us. The girls joined us soon after, and for a while the tension melted away in the crackling of the flames and the comfort of familiar company. We told stories, roasted marshmallows, and even had a couple of drinks. But the scratching returned. This time it was louder, closer, a slow, grating sound like claws dragging against wood. I went rigid, my eyes darting toward the cabin. The noise seemed to be coming from the far side, the wall facing the forest. Everyone else heard it too. The conversation faltered, and an uneasy silence fell over us. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Probably a raccoon or something," Sam offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. "I'll go check it out." "No way," I blurted out, standing up. "We stick together. Let's just go inside for now." Reluctantly, everyone nodded, and we hurried back into the cabin, closing the door behind us. I locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching stopped as soon as we were inside, leaving only the crackling of the dying fire outside and the faint rustle of leaves. "Maybe we should head back tomorrow," Jenny said nervously, glancing toward the windows. "Come on, guys," Sam replied, trying to sound upbeat. "We're overreacting. Let's just get some sleep, and it'll all seem less creepy in the morning." No one argued, but the unease lingered as we got ready for bed. Sarah and Jenny retreated to the bedroom, leaving Sam and me to the living room. I unfolded the couch into a bed, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. Hours passed, and the cabin grew colder. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak and groan of the wooden walls as they settled. Sam had dozed off beside me, his soft snores the only sound, but then I heard it again, the scratching. It was louder this time, more insistent, like something was dragging its claws across the outside of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat as I turned my head to the window, eyes straining to see anything in the darkness. Shadows moved among the trees, but I couldn't make out any shapes. Slowly, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sam, and tiptoed to the window. The scratching continued, now coming from just outside, near the corner of the cabin. I peered through the glass, holding my breath, searching for any sign of movement, and then I saw it. A tall, hunched figure moved through the shadows at the edge of the forest. It was covered in fur, its limbs unnaturally long, and it walked on two legs. My breath hitched in my throat as it stepped into a sliver of moonlight, revealing its face, a grotesque, wolf-like snout, with eyes that gleamed with a malevolent intelligence. It raised one hand, no, a claw, and dragged it slowly along the cabin wall, the scratching sound vibrating through the wood. I stumbled back from the window, my stomach churning with fear. "Sam," I whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "Sam, wake up!" He groaned, blinking blearily at me. "What is it?" "There's something outside," I hissed, pointing to the window. "I saw it." He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and glanced toward the window. "What do you mean, something?" "I don't know. It looked like a wolf, but standing on two legs. It was huge," I stammered, my mind racing. "Are you serious?" he asked, but I could see the fear creeping into his eyes. He grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the window, peeking out cautiously. The scratching stopped, plunging the cabin into an eerie silence. We stood there, frozen, listening for any hint of movement outside, and then the sound changed. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the darkness, vibrating through the walls and into our bones. "What the hell is that?" Sam breathed, backing away from the window. I shook my head, unable to speak. The growling grew louder, followed by a heavy thud against the wall, making the entire cabin shudder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, began circling the cabin, slow and methodical. "Everyone, wake up!" I shouted, panic surging through me as I pounded on the bedroom door. Sarah and Jenny stumbled out, their eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" Sarah cried, clutching Jenny's arm. "There's something outside," I gasped. "We need to stay quiet and turn off all the lights." Sam killed the flashlight, and we huddled together in the middle of the living room, our breaths shallow and rapid. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the sound of something sniffing, its breath rasping against the window pane. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest as I listened, every muscle in my body tense. The creature was right outside, just inches away from us, separated only by the thin wall of the cabin. There was a soft scratching at the door, followed by another deep, guttural growl. We held our breath, praying it would move on, leave us alone. But then, with a sudden, violent crash, something slammed into the door, rattling it in its frame. The cabin seemed to vibrate with the force of the impact, and a scream escaped Jenny's lips before she could stop it. Silence. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, the growling stopped, replaced by a low, snarling laugh. I felt a chill race down my spine. It knew we were inside. It was toying with us. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. I glanced around, searching for anything we could use to defend ourselves. "Barricade the door," I said hoarsely. "Grab whatever you can, furniture, anything." We moved quickly, pushing the couch and a heavy armchair against the door, stacking anything we could find to block the entrance. The footsteps resumed, pacing back and forth outside, each step a reminder of the nightmare we were trapped in. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity as we huddled together, waiting for dawn. The creature circled the cabin, growling and scratching at the walls, but it never tried to break in again. It was as if it was letting us know that it could, but chose not to, for now. Finally, the first rays of light began to filter through the windows. The footsteps stopped, and for the first time all night, the woods grew quiet. We waited, hearts pounding, until the sun was fully up, casting warmth into the cabin. Sam crept to the window, peering outside. "It's gone," he whispered, relief evident in his voice. We didn't waste time. Grabbing our things, we bolted out of the cabin and down the trail to our car. None of us looked back. We drove away, the silence heavy and oppressive, as the reality of what had happened sank in. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just an animal. It was something ancient, something that had been stalking those woods long before we arrived. And as we left the cabin behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching us, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to cross its path. Story 19. They say the forest has a way of speaking to those who listen. I used to think it was just a saying, something romanticized by people who spent too much time hiking. But standing here now, in the silence of the early morning woods, I could feel it. The trees seemed to murmur warnings with every creak and rustle, and I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. I had been camping solo in these woods for years. The solitude, the serenity, it was my escape. But today, as I stepped out of my tent, I noticed something strange. Large, deep footprints surrounded my camp, and they weren't mine. Each impression was easily twice the size of my boot, and they formed a messy ring around the tent, as if something or someone had been pacing through the night, keeping watch. My heart began to pound in my chest as I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints were fresh, pressed into the damp soil with a force that suggested incredible weight. They were wide, with toes that fanned out, far too large to belong to any bear or human. I swallowed hard, my mind racing through the stories I'd dismissed as local folklore, stories of something ancient, powerful, and territorial, stories of Bigfoot. I forced myself to stand up, trying to shake off the fear that had taken hold. It had to be a prank, right? Some overzealous campers trying to scare me off, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. No human could make prints like these, not with this kind of size and depth. I took a shaky breath and decided to follow the tracks. Maybe it was a bear, or at least that's what I tried to convince myself as I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The forest seemed different today. It was quieter than usual, an unnerving stillness that pressed in on me from every side. Normally, the woods would be alive with the sounds of birds and insects, but now, nothing. Only the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig broke the silence. The footprints led me off the trail and deeper into the forest. I moved cautiously, my senses on high alert. Every so often, I would stop and listen, ears straining for any sound that might betray the presence of whatever had made those tracks. But all I heard was the hammering of my own heartbeat. After about a quarter mile, the tracks changed. They stopped following a straight line and began to weave erratically between the trees, as if whatever had made them was circling, watching, waiting. My breath quickened as I scanned the dense underbrush, expecting something to leap out at me at any moment, but there was nothing, just the trees, looming tall and ominous, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze that had suddenly picked up. Then I saw it. Up ahead, in a small clearing, a large branch had been snapped off a tree, hanging at an awkward angle. The break was clean, fresh sap glistening on the torn wood. I moved closer, staring up at the damage. The branch was at least 10 feet off the ground, and it had been snapped like a twig. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. No bear could reach that height, and no human could break a branch that thick with such ease. A rustling noise snapped me out of my trance. My head whipped around, and I peered into the trees. The rustling grew louder, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate. They moved through the underbrush, crunching leaves and snapping branches with each step. I raised my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows, but all I could see were the trees and the fog that was starting to settle in. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering despite my attempt to sound confident. "Is someone out there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped, and silence descended once again. My pulse quickened, my grip tightening around the flashlight. I scanned the forest, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, looking for any sign of movement. Then, just on the edge of my vision, something moved. A massive shape loomed between the trees, almost blending in with the bark and shadows. I squinted, heart pounding in my chest. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, covered in dark fur. I couldn't make out details, but I could see its outline, broad shoulders, and a head that seemed almost human, but not quite. The figure swayed slightly, as if shifting its weight from one foot to the other, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, fear seizing my body. The creature didn't move, it just stood there, a silent sentinel in the forest, staring at me, a warning. It was clear that I had crossed into its territory, and it was not pleased. I stumbled back another step, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Run? Stay still? My legs screamed at me to turn and bolt back to the safety of my campsite, but I was rooted in place, caught in the creature's gaze. Then it moved, not towards me, but to the side, almost gliding as it passed between 2 trees. It didn't look away from me, its eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, never breaking contact. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched it slip into the shadows, becoming one with the forest once more. The message was clear: leave now while you still can. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned on my heel and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor as I retraced my steps. The branches tore at my clothes, leaves and dirt flying up in my wake as I sprinted back toward my camp. My breath came in ragged gasps, every muscle in my body screaming for me to go faster. As I reached the edge of my campsite, I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving. The footprints were still there, circling the tent like a grim reminder. I grabbed my gear with shaky hands, shoving it into my backpack. My mind was racing, screaming at me to get out of these woods now. I didn't bother packing up the tent properly. I yanked out the stakes and stuffed it into my bag in a tangled mess. As I worked, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see the creature standing at the tree line, watching, but the forest remained silent, the shadows deep and unmoving. Once I had everything gathered, I slung the backpack over my shoulders and started back down the trail. I moved quickly, casting nervous glances behind me every few steps. The forest seemed to close in, the trees towering like silent sentinels, blocking out the sun that was just starting to break through the canopy. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot at the trailhead. My car sat there, looking out of place amidst the rugged wilderness. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, as I unlocked the door and threw my gear inside. I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, my heart still pounding. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the path I had come from. The forest looked calm, almost serene in the morning light, but I knew better. There was something out there, something ancient and powerful that had allowed me to leave. I started the engine, the sound cutting through the silence, and drove away without looking back. As the road twisted through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The stories I'd heard over the years suddenly seemed all too real, and the forest no longer felt like the sanctuary it once was. It was a place of secrets, of things that existed beyond the edge of understanding, and now I had come face to face with one of them. The tracks, the broken branches, the towering figure, they were a warning that this forest was its domain, and I was merely a trespasser. As I left the woods behind, the tension in my chest eased, but the memory of that dark, swaying shape remained. It would be a long time before I ventured back into the wilderness, if ever, because the forest had spoken to me that day, and its message was clear. Some places are not meant for humans, and there are things out there that guard them, things that won't hesitate to remind you whose territory you've crossed. Story 20. The smell was the first thing that hit me. It was sharp, acrid, and so overwhelming that I had to cover my nose and mouth with my sleeve as I stood there, staring at the mutilated remains of the deer. I had been a park ranger for years, and I'd seen my fair share of animal carcasses, but this was different. This wasn't just a kill, it was a display, a message carved out in blood and fur. I swallowed hard, glancing around the forest as if expecting to find some explanation for the gruesome scene. There was none. The air was heavy, unnaturally still, the kind of silence that makes you realize something is very wrong. My radio crackled at my side, a small comfort in the oppressive quiet. I had come out here to investigate reports of strange sounds and sightings, but I never expected to find something like this. The carcasses were spread out in a rough circle, like some kind of crude perimeter marking: deer, raccoons, and even a black bear, all of them ripped apart and half-eaten, their entrails glistening in the weak sunlight filtering through the canopy. My stomach churned, and I took a shaky breath, fighting the urge to retch. What could have done this? Crouching down, I examined the ground around the deer. The soil was soft, wet from the recent rain, making it easy to spot the tracks. They were large, far larger than any wolf or mountain lion. My heart skipped a beat as I studied them. They had the shape of a canine's paw, but with claws much longer than any I had ever seen, and they were set deep, indicating something incredibly heavy had made them. I stood up, glancing at the tree line. The feeling of being watched washed over me like a cold wave. I was intruding, crossing into a territory that wasn't mine, and the forest seemed to know it. My hand moved to the radio on my belt, my thumb hovering over the button. "Dispatch! This is Ranger Miller. I've found something. Animal carcasses. Lots of them. I'm going to need backup out here." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The radio crackled with static, followed by a calm reply. "Copy that, Ranger. Can you describe the scene?" It looks like a massacre. There are tracks here, something large, canine-like. I've never seen anything like it." "Understood. Backup is on its way. ETA is about 30 minutes. Stay safe out there, Miller." I clipped the radio back onto my belt and scanned the area again. 30 minutes. That was a long time to stand out here alone. I considered heading back to the trail, but curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know what I was dealing with. With my hand resting on the hilt of my knife for comfort, I took a few tentative steps into the perimeter marked by the carcasses. The smell grew stronger, a rancid mix of blood, rot, and something else, something musky and wild. I forced myself to keep moving, eyes scanning the ground for more tracks. The claw marks were everywhere, deep gouges in the earth, scraped into tree trunks, as if something was marking its territory. My heart pounded against my ribs as I followed the tracks deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around me. their branches creaking softly in the wind. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that made my blood turn to ice. It came from somewhere ahead, echoing through the trees like a warning. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I listened. The growl deepened, vibrating through the air, accompanied by the sound of something moving, slow, heavy steps crunching through the underbrush. I turned, raising my flashlight, and swept it across the trees. Shadows leaped and twisted, but nothing stood out. I strained my eyes, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I scanned the darkness. And then, just at the edge of the beam, I saw it. A hulking, dark shape moved between the trees, towering over the undergrowth. My heart skipped a beat. It was upright, walking on two legs, its form covered in matted fur. The creature paused, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been its face. It was wolf-like, but wrong. Its snout was too long, eyes glowing an unnatural yellow in the darkness. It bared its teeth, saliva glistening in the light, and let out another low growl that seemed to rattle the very ground beneath me. Holy! I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root as I tried to put distance between us. The creature didn't move, just watched me with those cold, intelligent eyes, as if weighing its options. I fumbled for my radio, yanking it off my belt. "Dispatch! I need backup now!" I shouted, panic rising in my voice. "There's something out here!" The creature moved, a flash of dark fur and muscle as it loped to the side, disappearing behind a tree. My flashlight darted after it, but it was gone, leaving only the swaying branches in its wake. "Ranger Miller, what's your status?" The radio crackled, but I barely heard it over the pounding of my own heartbeat. I forced myself to take a deep breath, my eyes still scanning the tree line. It's some kind of animal, but it's not like anything I've seen before. It's huge, walking on two legs. I think it's watching me. Copy that. Backup is 10 minutes out. Hold your position if possible. Hold my position. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of these woods as fast as possible, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I needed to know what this thing was. I took a cautious step back, keeping my flashlight trained on the trees. The creature had circled me. I was sure of it. I could hear it moving, the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig, always just out of sight. It was toying with me, letting me know that it was in control here. The growl came again, deeper this time, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. My skin prickled as I realized the source. It was behind me. I spun around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, and there it was, standing not 20 feet away. It was bigger than I had thought, easily 8 feet tall, its massive frame hunched as it watched me. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its lips curled back, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. My heart pounded, fear clawing up my throat as I faced the creature. It let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like a laugh, and took a step forward, its claws crunching on the forest floor. I stumbled back, my hand dropping to the knife at my belt. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice trembling. The creature paused, its head tilting slightly, as if considering my words. It let out a snort, a cloud of mist billowing from its nostrils in the cold air. And then, with a sudden, fluid movement, it turned and bounded into the darkness, its form melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. I stood there, gasping for breath, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just seen. Dogman, the stories, the sightings, they were real, and it had let me go. It could have attacked, torn me apart just like the animals littered around the perimeter, but it hadn't. A warning, that's what it was. A warning to stay out of its territory. My radio crackled to life again, the voice of dispatch cutting through the silence. "Ranger Miller, backup is en route to your location. What's your status?" I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as I raised the radio to my lips. I'm heading back to the trail. Tell the backup to stay on the main path. There's something out here, and it doesn't want us in its territory." I turned, my legs shaky but determined, and began to make my way back. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. As I walked, I could feel its eyes on me, watching from the shadows, ensuring I left the way I came. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, the relief flooding over me like a wave. But even as I walked back to the ranger station, the sense of being watched never left me. The forest had made its warning clear. This was its domain, and trespassers would not be tolerated. From that day on, I knew better than to wander too far into those woods, because something ancient, powerful, and fiercely territorial lurked among those trees, and it had given me a chance to live, to tell others to stay away. Story 21. The forest around us seemed eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath. I knew the Pacific Northwest was dense with old-growth trees and thick underbrush, but this place, this part of the forest, felt different. It was as if we had crossed an invisible line into somewhere that didn't want us there. As we pushed deeper, I noticed the trees. They weren't just growing wild. They had been arranged, snapped, twisted, and stacked into what looked like some kind of strange, primitive structure. "Guys, check this out," I called to my friends, unable to keep the tremor out of my voice. We had been hiking for hours, venturing off the marked trails in search of a supposed hidden waterfall, but the deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest felt wrong. "What is it?" Jake asked, panting as he joined me, followed closely by Maddie and Connor. They stopped short when they saw what I was staring at. In front of us was a grove, the trees within it forming an unnatural barricade. Large trunks were bent into arches, and others lay crisscrossed on the ground, their branches interwoven in a haphazard, almost intentional pattern. It wasn't something nature had done on its own. These trees had been shaped by something. "What the hell?" Maddie whispered, taking a cautious step forward. She reached out to touch one of the snapped branches, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't," I said, my voice more forceful than I intended. "We shouldn't touch anything. It's like someone built this," Jake laughed nervously. "Or something." "You mean," he said, though the humor in his voice didn't reach his eyes. "What? You think Bigfoot did this?" I didn't answer. I just stared at the trees, the feeling of being watched prickling the back of my neck. "We need to turn around," I muttered, my gaze scanning the forest around us. "We shouldn't be here." Connor, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "Come on, Mark. It's just some weird wind damage or something." "Let's keep moving." He brushed past me, stepping into the grove with a casualness that made my skin crawl. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, I swear the air grew colder, the shadows darker. A part of me screamed to grab him, pull him back, but I was rooted to the spot, my heart thudding in my chest. "See, nothing to—" Connor began, but his voice cut off as a loud crack echoed through the grove. We all froze, eyes wide, listening. It wasn't the sound of a branch snapping underfoot. It was deeper, like the trunk of a massive tree being twisted and broken. "What was that?" Maddie whispered, her eyes darting around in panic. Jake shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but we need to go. Now." I didn't argue. We turned to leave, but as we did, the forest came alive with sound. Heavy, rhythmic thumps began echoing from the woods around us, accompanied by a series of guttural, low grunts. It was as if the forest itself had begun to breathe. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, grabbing Maddie's arm and pulling her back the way we had come. We ran, dodging branches and leaping over roots, the sound of something massive moving through the trees behind us. The thumping footsteps were heavy, deliberate, like someone or something was keeping pace with us. I glanced back, my heart nearly stopping as I caught a glimpse of a hulking, shadowy figure moving through the trees. It was tall, impossibly so, and covered in thick, dark hair. It moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, despite its size, its arms swinging in long arcs as it pushed through the underbrush. "Keep moving!" I shouted, fear spurring me forward. My legs burned, lungs screaming for air as we raced through the forest. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer, as if the creature was closing in. Then the knocking started. Loud, deliberate knocks, like wood striking wood, echoed through the trees around us. They seemed to come from every direction, surrounding us, trapping us. It wasn't random. It was a signal, a message we couldn't understand, but instinctively knew was meant to warn us. "What the hell is that?" Maddie gasped, her eyes wild with terror. "It's them," I choked out, stumbling over a root. "It's their territory." "Bigfoot!" Jake wheezed, his face pale. "You're seriously saying it's Bigfoot?" I didn't answer because I didn't have to. We all knew it wasn't just an animal. Whatever was out there was intelligent, and it wanted us gone. We stumbled into a small clearing, panting, our eyes darting around as we tried to get our bearings. The knocking continued, growing more frenzied, more urgent. And then, for a split second, everything went silent. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, a massive, towering figure, its broad shoulders nearly touching the branches above. It was covered in dark, matted fur, its face shadowed by the dense canopy, but I could see its eyes, two glints of amber, reflecting the dim light, staring right at us. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched us, its chest rising and falling with each slow, deep breath. I felt paralyzed, the world narrowing to just that moment, that impossible creature standing mere yards away. "Don't move," I whispered, though every fiber of my being screamed to run. The creature tilted its head slightly, its eyes unblinking, and then it raised one massive arm, reaching toward the trees beside it. With a swift, powerful motion, it struck a tree with its hand, the impact sending a shockwave through the clearing. The sound was like a gunshot, a sharp crack that made us all flinch, a warning. "Back away," I hissed, starting to step backward, never taking my eyes off the creature. The others followed suit, moving slowly, cautiously, as we edged toward the trail that had brought us here. The creature didn't pursue. It stayed rooted in place, its gaze following us as we retreated, but I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken threat that hung between us. We were in its domain, and it was giving us one chance to leave. Step by step, we backed out of the clearing and into the woods. The moment we hit the trail, we turned and ran, the creature's presence a dark weight pressing on our backs. The knocking resumed, echoing through the forest like an ancient drumbeat, driving us forward, pushing us away. Branches whipped against my face as we fled, and my lungs burned with every ragged breath. I didn't look back, couldn't bring myself to, not until the forest began to thin, and I saw the faint glimmer of sunlight through the trees. We burst onto the main trail, collapsing onto the ground in a heap, gasping for air. My heart hammered in my chest, my mind reeling from what we had just seen. Maddie was crying, her hands covering her face, while Jake and Connor sat in stunned silence, eyes wide with shock. What was that?" Connor finally managed to choke out, his voice trembling. I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. "I don't know," I whispered, staring back at the dark path we had just come from. But it didn't want us there. We sat there for a few moments, letting the reality of what had happened sink in. The forest around us was quiet again. The knocking faded into distant memory. But I knew, deep down, that we had come dangerously close to something ancient, something that had claimed those woods long before we had stumbled into them. Slowly, we stood up, supporting each other as we began the hike back to the parking lot. No one spoke as we walked, each of us lost in our thoughts. The silence a heavy reminder of the encounter we had barely escaped. As we left the forest behind, I glanced back one last time. The path was empty, the woods calm, but I could feel eyes watching us from the shadows. We had been given a warning, a chance to leave unscathed, and we were smart enough to take it. From that day forward, I never ventured off the marked trails, because some places in the forest are not meant to be explored, guarded by creatures that exist in the spaces between legend and reality. And if you cross into their territory, you might not be as lucky as we were to make it back.